Our story begins in Seoul in 2021, where life at first glance seems calm and everything goes on as usual. In the backyard of one of the ordinary educational institutions, a completely natural phenomenon was taking place. Four hooligans, led by a guy with a cockerel hairdo, wanted to make fun of one of the ordinary schoolchildren. Despite this, the guy with glasses behaved calmly and measuredly. He thoughtfully looked at his notebook and asked the hooligans to hurry up with their dialogue so that he would not be late for the academy. The enraged leader of the hooligans was not particularly pleased with his words and, like a typical antagonist, began to scratch the back of his head, discontentedly repeating the name of this guy. Without taking his eyes off his notebook, the bespectacled boy named Do Jae-min walked past the cheeky student, saying that if they didn't have any questions for him, then he would move on. As soon as the young man began to move away, the rest of the hooligans, looking at the trembling boss, began to laugh that he was ignored. Of course, this seemed like a blow to his pride and authority, so Soo-hyuk shouted at the impudent youth that he should stop if he wanted to live. Do Jae-min continued to remain calm and didn't even look away from his notebook when the bully lunged at him with a punch. With a sly laugh, Jae-min closed his red notebook at the last moment, satisfied that his provocation had been taken in after all. At that moment, he suddenly changed the course of events with his sudden kick to the face of the boss of this gang of hooligans. The blow caused Soo-hyuk to lose his balance and fall to the ground, while his opponent, still standing, silently watched the result. The bully winced in pain. He was angry, and his whole body began to tremble from the simultaneous rage and helplessness in this situation. It seemed that after this, his authority would be significantly shaken. Jae-min looked at the boy lying on the ground, hoping that he realized that he was not the one to behave like that with. Getting up from the ground, Soo-hyuk grabbed his cheek and glared at his bastard, calling him an insulting nickname. Sighing heavily, he replied that the bully could act tough as much as he wanted, but only as long as he didn't touch him. Demonstrating calm and determination, he said that he was not interested in them because he had enough problems without them. Hearing such a bold speech, the guy who felt like a real gangster smiled slyly and said that he shouldn't act so self-confident in a fight where four people were standing against him. Jae-min stood with his hands on his hips and didn't even notice how a purple-haired bastard with a bat in his hands approached him from behind. With a sly smile, he struck the guy with glasses on the back of the head, and he barely remained conscious, almost falling to the ground. Coming from behind, the smug bully who had struck with the bat reminded Jae-min that he shouldn't be so overconfident, knowing that it wasn't just Soo-hyuk who was up against him. They really weren't joking with him. After this blow, blood started to flow from the back of his head, and it began to slowly drip onto the ground, staining his snow-white shirt. Everything suddenly changed in favor of the bullies, and Soo-hyuk began to laugh slyly. Sitting down opposite the poor guy, the disgusting leader of the gang of hooligans with a sly smile suggested that Jae-min was in damn pain after he missed such a vile blow to the back of his head. When the bully explained that it was precisely because of moments like these that he had to be a good boy, not even daring to argue with them at school, Jae-min responded with brazen anger, swearing at the bullies. This disrespectful gesture made Soo-hyuk even more angry. Feeling like the leader of the gang and being in a more advantageous position, he said with anticipation that he wondered how long this poor guy could last in an unfair beating. Looking haughtily at the boy who was barely able to kneel, he ordered his guys to take charge of his education. The disgusting bastards began to beat the poor guy without a drop of pity, and the smug Soo-hyuk began to slowly walk away, looking around with an evil grin. Suddenly he noticed a small purple glow appear in the air. He waved his hand, not losing his composure, but was surprised by what was happening. Looking around, he noticed that more and more of these small purple balls with a strange glow began to appear, and now they could be seen even next to his guys who were beating up Jae-min. Suddenly, this glow intensified significantly. These strange purple balls filled the area, and the light became simply blinding. Covering his eyes, Soo-hyuk couldn't see what was happening, and his friends suddenly stopped beating the poor guy. When the purple light stopped, the surprised boys began to discuss what had happened, but no one had any idea what the origin of this light was. Soo-hyuk didn't lose his composure, but he found it very strange. Taking advantage of the moment, Jae-min began to try to get to his feet with great difficulty. Seeing him trying to escape, Soo-hyuk pinned his head to the ground with his foot and shouted that he had no right to even move until they gave him permission. With a smug smile, the hooligan continued to enjoy this atmosphere of impunity, where he was at the top of the local hierarchy. Suddenly, a guy with black hair appeared next to him and said with surprise that the local hooligans had not changed even after 20 years. His sudden appearance caught the leader of the gang of hooligans by surprise, and he was even a little scared, although he tried not to pretend that it was so. In response, the strange guy began to examine his clothes with great curiosity, saying that even the school uniform had not changed in 20 years. The bully was clearly confused, asking the others what was wrong with this homeless man in strange clothes from some distant past. The guy in the shabby country shirt and strange shoes took it as an insult and asked the bully with displeasure if he knew who he had just called a homeless person. At this point, the hooligan seemed a little confused, not from fear, but from not understanding who they were dealing with. They assumed that this was a senior from their school, but this guy really looked more like a Lost Village eccentric. Meanwhile, Jae-min was able to take a short breather after this beating. He looked with particular interest at the strange guy who dared to appear in front of 3 hooligans with such calmness. Sighing, the dark-haired stranger said that although it all looked like a conflict between friends, it would not be very right to leave everything like this. He did not care whether the people in front of him were high school students or not. In response, the self-confident and as impudent as ever, So-hyuk pointed his finger at him and angrily said that he should stop meddling in other people's business and go where he was going. He continued his disrespectful speech by asking what some homeless guy was doing at their showdown. Asking if he really wanted to be beaten up by junior high school students, he nervously urged him to stop acting like a jerk and leave as quickly as possible. After listening to this self-confident speech, the guy in the strange, tattered clothes mockingly asked why the youth were so rude and disrespectful these days. He said that they were not dealing with some homeless person, but with a great high school student who was 20 years older than them. His words sounded like the ramblings of a madman, so So-hyuk placed his fist on the guy's chest as a warning and told him to run as far as he could before he got into trouble. The guy with the black unkempt hair had reached the limit of his patience, and in response he grabbed the rude man by the arm and said that he would break his arm if he continued to irritate him. This guy's grip was really strong, but he wasn't completely serious, and so Hyuk was able to break free from his grip, shouting that there was some crazy suicide in front of them. Now it was clear that this situation would not end without a fight. Swinging his fist high, an enraged So-hyuk shouted that the homeless man had played at being brave. He aimed his blow with all his might towards the face of the calmly standing guy. However, the mysterious stranger easily avoided this furious blow. So-hyuk didn't even have time to realize that he had missed. Looking to the side, he saw that the crazy stranger had managed to slip away and was already standing a few meters away from him. With his hands folded in front of him, the boy in village clothes responded to his insolence by saying that he had gone too far in calling the high school student crazy. Looking at his hand, he sternly said that they would still receive their punishment, but first they would be able to see something incredibly frightening. After this mysterious speech, the stranger raised his hand high and began to pronounce some mysterious words with a frighteningly confident expression on his face. Every word he said reminded the kids of the moment in some movie where a villainous magician suddenly appears. Having finished some unintelligible spell reading, the stranger snapped his fingers. The boys were horrified, because they didn't know what else to expect from the madman, before whose appearance a mysterious purple light appeared. However, despite their worries, nothing happened, and after the strange movements of this young man, silence reigned on the back platform of the school. The weird high school boy with the weird haircut didn't understand why his spell wasn't working. He kept snapping his fingers in different directions, but nothing happened. The bullies he encountered started to lose their temper. The high school student, looking at his hand, began to be genuinely surprised that the magic wasn't working, while So-hyuk, sighing heavily, began to grimace in anger. He couldn't believe that in one day he would meet 2 idiots who behaved incomprehensibly. First, they came across a bespectacled man who dared to contradict them on his own. The second irritable person turned out to be some crazy guy who was doing some kind of nonsense right in front of their eyes. Returning to his hometown after 20 years due to some unforeseen circumstances, the mysterious young man was nevertheless convinced that his magic did not work as before. However, even despite this, he looked at the impudent bully and understood that he could not just give it up. Looking at So-hyuk, He said threateningly that even though he hadn't managed to scare them with his abilities, they had already played too much. A moment later, the mysterious high school student appeared right in front of the leader of the bullies and aimed his flick at him. The blow was so strong that it threw the poor guy several meters away, so Hyuk found himself on the ground for the second time in 20 minutes after he hit his back hard against the wall. Everyone present was shocked. Jae-min couldn't believe what had happened, and the frightened hooligans couldn't even move from their place. One flick from this terrifyingly strong senior was enough to knock one of the school's strongest bullies unconscious. From such a strong blow, smoke began to come out from the high school student's middle finger. With a smile that anticipated the fun, he slyly, and at the same time maliciously asked who would be next. A moment later, Jae-min still couldn't move. He was shocked because all his offenders, including the guy with the bat, ended up on the ground. They were helpless against the strange guy in village clothes. Even the leader of the hooligans, who is an excellent fighter, lost consciousness from just one flick. With a shocked look, Jae-min tried to comprehend how it was possible that someone could beat 4 hooligans with just one finger. Although those guys were insignificant, they were at the same time strong enough to stand up to even high school students who practice martial arts. The discipline lesson was over, but it remained a mystery to everyone who this strange guy in ridiculous clothes was and what he was doing in this school. Rising to his feet, Jae-min bowed and respectfully thanked the stranger for his help. When the strange guy started looking intently at him, the guy with glasses thought that he was worried about his condition, so he said that he was fine because his hard head was capable of withstanding even greater loads. However, what the strange young man was interested in caught him off guard. This high school student in homeless clothes wanted to know what day it was. In response, the guy in glasses said that it was now the 10th of September. The stranger was truly surprised when he learned that we were talking about. Putting his hand to his face, the stranger began to talk in surprise about how he was called in 2016, so he thought that after 20 years of his absence in Seoul, exactly 20 years should have passed. He did not understand what had happened wrong, that during his absence in this world, only 5 years had passed. While Jae-min couldn't figure out what was wrong with this strange guy, he decided that it was for the best. Saying goodbye to the poor guy with glasses, the dark-haired weirdo asked him not to get into any more fights. The strange guy began to leave, but his identity remained a mystery. Suddenly he stopped and raised his hand up, raising even more questions about his sanity. He seemed too crazy for a high school student, as his behavior once again seemed crazy due to him snapping his fingers and nervously shouting about some kind of teleportation. After trying in vain to use some crazy magic, he suddenly turned around and looked at the guy with glasses again, causing his whole body to tremble. Then he began to slowly walk towards him, causing genuine fear due to the mystery and strangeness of his actions. When he approached the bespectacled guy, he awkwardly asked him what his name was. Jae-min introduced himself but was clearly confused, not knowing what to expect from this madman. Looking at the poor fellow with particular curiosity, the high school student asked if he had any money. The abnormal person literally cornered the decent student and started whispering nonsense in his ear about how he had returned too early and still couldn't use his magic. The high school student confessed that he had just returned from another world to Earth via molecular teleportation. When he started talking about how something had happened to the mana management system during the process, Jae-min couldn't stand it and anxiously asked how much money he needed. Even though this guy asked for 2,001, Jae-min was kind enough to give him a whole 5,001 just to get him to leave him alone. Walking through the city, the high school student thought about what a good friend he had met, because he even gave him money, so he would need to repay him somehow. Looking at the building with its shiny windows, he suddenly began to stare at his reflection and stopped. 20 years had passed since his teleportation to the magical world, but in earthly time it was only 5 years, and now he had no doubt that he was very lucky in this regard. Now 24 years old, he knew that his family would likely still recognize him. On the way, he saw something strange, something that was different from the ordinary situation 5 years ago. At the entrance to the metro, there were signs prohibiting passage, and next to them stood fully armed soldiers, who looked with some excitement in the direction of the descent down. Scratching his head, the high school student wondered what was going on there. Kang Woo-jin couldn't think of a better method for reconnaissance than to approach 2 pretty girls in government uniforms. He asked what had happened, that the military was blocking his path right at the entrance to the metro. The girls, surprised by his sudden question, looked around. After a moment of silence, they began to laugh at the suddenness of such an obvious question, saying that it was nothing strange, since all the entrances to the subway were now under strict guard. They assumed that he had escaped from North Korea, since he did not know what was happening underground now. As they left laughing, they still hadn't given him a clear answer, and Woo Jin wondered if he should teach them a lesson in politeness. Still, he didn't raise his hand to the girls and walk towards the bus stop to take the bus home instead of the metro. As he had guessed, there were no military personnel at the stop, but he found another entrance to the metro nearby that was not guarded by the military. His curiosity led him downstairs, where he found himself confronted with a grate blocking further progress into the subway. There was a lock on the door, which made him realize that something was indeed happening in the subway. It was locked here, and there was no light at all. Moreover, it was clear that even the booth where tickets were bought was covered in dust, because no one had been down there for a long time. To his surprise, the key to the door lock was lying in plain sight. The curious boy who had returned from another world went further. It was his first time in the subway, which for some reason was not working. His conclusions were quite amusing. He continued to confirm his guess that the security service had completely closed at least this station. Returning to the entrance, he was disappointed, thinking that he had come to this place in vain. However, the moment he tried to open the door, he felt that it was impossible, and a system window appeared in front of him, telling him that he had entered the dungeon. The guy was puzzled. He saw the system window for the first time since returning to his home world, and exiting the dungeon was prohibited. Now he realized that the girl's words about guarding the dungeon were not a coincidence. This place was no longer an ordinary subway. It was no longer used for transportation. The status window clarified that this dungeon was already in the process of being cleared, but since he had joined the process, he had no way to leave the area. The monsters in the subway station were an unexpected discovery. Woo Jin had no idea what had happened to the land in the past 5 years. Touching the door, he was once again convinced that there was no way out. The status window appeared in front of him again, telling him that he needed a return stone to exit. Suddenly he felt like he sensed monsters approaching. A rustling and strange sound coming from the darkness made him wary. Suddenly a monster with red fur, resembling some kind of wolf, appeared behind him. Kang Woo Jin's reflexes were enough to dodge this sneaky attack. Despite this, the monster had no intention of retreating. His predatory gaze indicated that he was about to attack again. Pointing his palm at him, Woo Jin uttered the name of his ability, attempting to use restraint. However, this ability never worked, and the monster had already rushed to attack him. Kang Woo Jin was once again convinced that his magical power still didn't work on Earth. This time he again had to avoid the attack by dodging it. He managed to cope with this monster using his own reflexes and the brute force of his body. Taking a closer look at this monster, he suddenly realized that he was already looking at a familiar creature. The predatory red wolf he had started the battle with turned out to be a dwarf. Drebit charged again, but Woo Jin continued to wonder why the monster from Alphen was in his home world. Always dodging his attacks seemed like madness. Luckily, Woo Jin noticed a fire crowbar lying on the ground nearby. Dodging another attack from the Drebit, he rushed towards the metal tool to use it as a weapon. Rising to his feet, he looked at the monster with a sly smile, realizing his advantage. Armed with a crowbar, he decided that he had no choice but to get rid of this monster in order to figure out his further path. The predatory creature began to growl furiously, rushing to attack again. However, this time Woo Jin didn't dodge. He easily dealt a fatal blow to this monster. Although Kang Woo Jin was left without magic even for his basic skills, fighting against Drebit was child's play. As expected, it didn't end there. Looking around, Kang Woo Jin saw another small flock of Drebit approaching. With an anticipatory smile, the boy who had been investigating the changes in his homeworld assumed that these guys had lined up specifically to entertain him. As expected, he had no trouble dealing with even such a flock of Drebitoi. There wasn't a single scratch on his body, which wasn't surprising, but he knew that if someone much stronger appeared, there might be problems. Suddenly, a notification from the system appeared in front of him, informing him that he had gained a level up. Now he realized that he had not just been transported back to Earth, he had become a newbie again, although he also belonged to the necromancer class. Despite the lost progress, he was still an experienced fighter and was not against going through this path a second time. He thought that there was nothing wrong with getting stronger while these creatures were running around Seoul. Looking at his progress window again, He thought about how the necromancer class was probably retained due to his status as a mage transported from another world. For returning to level 1 instead of level 99, he was given stat and skill points, and he also received some transferred abilities, a combination box, and access to some kind of achievement store. After looking at the new features, he learned that he could now combine materials to create items, and the achievement shop, which was not available in Alphen, was like online shopping. At this moment, he needed skills and a return stone the most. To fight monsters, he first thought about acquiring the ability to detect and summon a skeleton soldier. Each skill required 10 points from him. He still did not have enough resources for this, so he decided to first raise his stats. After using the stat boosting points, he immediately felt the relief of leveling up. In this way, he used up all his points and his strength increased significantly. As he swung the crowbar, he realized that he could now fight with greater speed, striking with a much greater range. This was quite good, as it turned out. Ordinary weapons were not enough to cope with his new power. The goal was very clear. He had to continue fighting to collect another 5 achievement points in order to acquire the search skill, which would make it possible to locate the return stone. The only thing left to do was to deal with 5 more drebbits to get 5 points. Even without any special skills, he could sense the presence of these budding monsters. The drebbits began to approach him again, making the task easier. Wu Jin was glad that the monsters were nearby because that way he could find the stone and get out much faster. After a long battle, he destroyed the last drebbit that was within range. He didn't expect that after returning, his body would be so weakened that such a battle would cause him some difficulty. There were too many drebbits and they never ended, but thanks to this, he managed to rise to the 3rd level. By opening the system search, he acquired the skills of searching and tracking. Having acquired the new skill, Wu Jin used it without hesitation, but in this room he found nothing but the bodies of the destroyed drebbits. It became obvious that the return stone was somewhere near the train landing, but looking down the stairs and seeing the many drebbits, Wu Jin wondered whether he should go down and make his life more difficult with another grueling battle. Even with his vast experience in another world, he knew that fighting everyone at once would be too risky. Moreover, being an experienced necromancer, he thought that doing this alone was not his style. With this thought, he entered the achievement shop again and purchased the Skeleton Soldier Summon Skill Book. The system informed him that in order to use the skill, he needed to sacrifice a monster corpse to summon a skeleton soldier. Being experienced in this matter, Wu Jin immediately distributed 10 points between mana and control. Pointing his hand at the fallen drebbits, he even shed tears from the fact that he once again had the opportunity to use the power with which he had already once reached the maximum level. Commanding the fallen monsters to rise again, he used magic for the first time since his return. A malicious smile appeared on his face, and his gaze became wild with anticipation of the duel he was accustomed to. Together with his small squad of skeletons, he was ready to go on his first hunt in a long time. He led his nimble lads down to the boarding point for the metro trains and ordered the fighters to rush into the attack. The Drebbites responded in kind, the first of them launching a furious attack and immobilizing several skeletons, as they were significantly superior in strength. In turn, the skeletons fought back, dealing critical hits, but this was still not enough. It soon became clear that the current skeletons were no match for the dreadful beasts of this dungeon. Wu Jin was lucky to get into the place for a beginner fighter, because these skeletons were enough to repel the first dangerous attack of the drebbits. He ordered the skeletons to block the enemies with their bodies to slow down their attack. Having chosen a convenient moment, he finished off the weakened monsters with his own hands. After they destroyed the first gang of monsters, it became possible to use the fallen drebbits to summon more soldiers. Within a moment, the forces gradually began to equalize in number, because the new skeletons were already ready for battle. Despite the fact that the balance of power was changing right before our eyes, the novice monsters did not feel any particular danger and continued to rush into battle. Using the previous strategy, Wu Jin once again ordered his subordinates to block the monsters with their bodies. With a mad smile, the user of the ordinary crowbar rushed into the attack again. At that moment he seemed crazy, because with the help of this unusual weapon, he began to tear apart the bodies of monsters with a scream. The drebbits were indeed no match for him, and by using fallen enemies he had significantly increased his army. Having destroyed the rest of the monsters, the guy was ready to return home. He used the search skill again, and a noticeable red light appeared nearby, indicating the location of the return stone. Meanwhile, one of the government workers began walking towards this descent into the metro, near which there was no security. The guy, with his hands in his pockets, went downstairs, not suspecting what had happened during his absence. Looking at the grate that blocked the descent into the metro, he was stunned. During his absence, someone broke in, which he clearly did not expect. The emotion of panic was clearly visible on his face. This was due to the realization that some crazy civilian had gotten inside. The boy clutched his head, realizing that it would be the end for him if anyone found out about what had happened. He started calling somewhere, thinking that he should call for help as quickly as possible in order to find the madman who most likely already said goodbye to his life in a battle with monsters. Suddenly, he caught his breath as he saw a blue glow on the other side of the bars. Some kind of portal appeared in front of him through which Wu Jin came out. The boy suddenly started screaming and stopped the phone call when he saw that some strange high school student in village clothes was able to get inside and return to the entrance of the dungeon without any problems. Seeing Wu Jin, he shouted and assumed that he was one of the awakened ones. Meanwhile, on the streets of Seoul, there was another young man who had quietly snuck into the dungeon without any permission or hunter's license. His backpack was full of red mana crystals, which he called quite a catch. Apparently, this wasn't the first time he had done something like this. Looking at his trophies, he talked about the injustice of the current world. According to him, the scum from the guilds get all the profits for themselves, although in reality, it is people like him who risk their lives participating in raids. Pleased with his catch, the guy began to slowly walk towards the exit of these back alleys, arguing out loud that only fools would take this stuff to the procurement center, considering that on the black market, these crystals would fetch several times more. Suddenly, he froze in place when he heard a female voice calling him a rat. He turned around and asked in panic who was following him, and in response, he heard a question about how much he had managed to steal in this way. With a dominant tone of voice, the woman with red hair and bright red lipstick said that he was hardly unprepared for the consequences. The confident girl, who is an awakened warrior class, introduced herself to him as the scythe-wielding Death, who came to take back what was stolen from her. The boy was in a bad situation, being cornered by the captain of the Cinnabar team from the Hwarang Guild. Lee Yoon-hee asked with a menacing look how he dared to steal the bloodstones from their dungeon. With her hands outstretched, she seemed to be offering him a compromise, saying that if he already knew her, then they could settle the matter in a less bloody way if he went with her. However, the boy was trembling with fear, knowing that being caught was a disaster, and running into her was death. The only chance he had to survive was to escape immediately, so he immediately began using magic. At that moment, he used magic, shouting that he would never surrender to some dogs from the big guilds. With these words, he aimed a large number of ice magic bullets at her. However, the experienced A-rank hunter easily dodged them, continuing to track the poor guy's every move. His maneuver didn't delay Yoon-hee for a second, but the boy had no other option but to start escaping. A moment later, she suddenly appeared right in front of him, and with a wild thirst for blood said that he had chosen death. A moment later, she was already behind him, and deep cuts left by her blade appeared all over the poor guy's body. The terrifying monster in the form of a red-haired girl, looking away from the boy's agony, said that he should have listened when she offered him a compromise in the form of sparing his life. After these words, she left the poor guy lying in this nook and taking his backpack with crystals. She looked at the message on her mobile phone, which surprised her with the news that there was another unauthorized intrusion into their portal. Yoon-hee was indescribably angry to learn that another madman had appeared nearby and dared to invade their territory. Meanwhile, Wu Jin, who was the second intruder, was already far away from the crime scene. He took the bus to another part of the city. He couldn't get the thought out of his head that his home world had become filled with dungeons and monsters. Now Earth was more like Alphen than the place where he grew up. Remembering how stubbornly the entrances to the metro were defended, he wondered what had happened during the 5 years of his absence. Hoping that nothing had happened to his family, he arrived at the place where his house had previously been located. It was a real shock for him that his area had been transformed beyond recognition. His house disappeared without a trace, and in its place appeared some huge corporate building. Seeing this high-rise building, he immediately realized that most likely his family had changed their place of residence, selling their apartment for the benefit of some guild. Considering the time it took him to get to this place, He knew it was too late to look for his family's place of residence. On the other hand, he hadn't eaten anything since he returned to Earth. Luckily, the money he got from Jae-min was enough to visit a small establishment. For the first time in the 20 years he had spent in Alphen, he finally tasted something truly delicious, connected to his former life on Earth. Instant noodles gave him at least some positive emotions after a series of disappointments he faced upon returning to his hometown. Having eaten his fill and washed it all down with soda, he sighed with relief, and placing his hands on his stomach full of food, joyfully said that he finally felt like he was back on Earth. And yet the joy of returning had another side. He still had a poor understanding of what his native soul was like now. Moreover, he had no place to spend the night. Looking at the change left in his pocket, he thought that he did not want to go to the bathhouse, and there was not enough money for an internet cafe. He also couldn't spend the night in the metro, as people with housing problems usually do, because it's teeming with monsters, and in most cases is a heavily guarded facility. He didn't yet know that on the first day after returning home, incredible luck would follow him. Besides the fact that he managed to avoid meeting Yoon-hee, the person he had left without money for a proper cafe was approaching the shop where he stopped to get ramen. The sudden meeting upon my return turned out not to be sudden. After the front door creaked, Woo Jin, as usual, looked at the person entering and froze in surprise. Jae-min had the same reaction. He hoped that he would never meet this weirdo again, who saved him from the hooligans. Seeing this old man in a place like this after a hard day was the worst possible outcome for him, but Woo Jin turned out to be a really lucky guy. As soon as he saw the poor guy in glasses, he immediately rushed towards him and, smiling, clapping him on the back, said that he just wanted to meet him. When Jae-min heard the question about whether his parents were home, he was very confused. Woo Jin, understanding his concerns, decided to be cunning and said that he wanted to talk to them about what happened earlier. After this question, Jae-min said with some sadness that his parents had passed away. Woo Jin was so caught up in his brilliant plan to use this young man that he was initially happy with his answer, but after a moment, he corrected himself and expressed his condolences. Now Jae-min couldn't dispute the assumption that he lived alone. Understanding this, Woo Jin, without further questions, invited him to come and visit him as soon as possible. Jae-min was at a loss, as he couldn't comprehend how he had been so cleverly deceived. With an obsessive smile, Woo Jin took his hand and said that he would stay the night with him, but not for free. As it turned out, with these words he gave him 300 won, which was left over from the 5,000 he had received from this poor guy earlier. The confused schoolboy, seeing these coins, said that this was probably the money that he had shared with him that same morning. A moment later he heard a sudden whistle near his left ear, so Woo Jin decided to change the subject, saying that he had just killed a fly that was trying to land on his dear comrade's ear. Jae-min was depressed. He had no choice but to accept this joke of fate. Even the promises that he would get back everything that was due to him did not calm him down. The next day the boys went to school together. First of all, Woo Jin shocked his teacher with his appearance. The elderly man responded to his appearance with a trembling voice, saying that he could not believe that he was alive. With a smile on his face, Woo Jin, who now looked more like some kind of maniac, said that he was glad for their long-awaited meeting. Over a cup of coffee, they had a short conversation in which the teacher tried to find out where Woo Jin had been all this time. Everyone was afraid that he had died due to the sudden appearance of dungeons from which monsters began to break through. In response, Woo Jin said that he technically died and came back. As expected, the teacher didn't pay much attention to such nonsense, still thinking that this guy had become very strange and needed psychological help. The conversation that followed concerned what was happening at this time, but due to the stupidity of the questions asked, Woo Jin never learned anything interesting. The only useful information he got from his teacher was the list of students in the school. As expected, his classmates had long since entered universities or found jobs, so the only person he knew was Ko Jae-min. The polite guy with glasses attracted the attention of the girls, which really got on the nerves of the guys in his class, including So Hyuk, a bully with whom he constantly had conflicts. This cheeky guy once again showed his disgusting character by pushing a student aside on his way to Jae-min. Placing his hand on his shoulder, he reminded him in a rude tone that his luck was not due to his personal strength, but to the fact that some madman had appeared out of nowhere and interrupted their lesson in politeness. With an angry and threatening look, he asked if he thought they should finish the conversation they had started earlier. Jae-min calmly replied that he would listen to his words, but only if he stopped making noise in the classroom. His words and calmness in such a situation made the bully furious. In response, he grabbed the poor guy by the hair and shouted that he needed to think again about the situation he was in and how he should behave in front of them. Just before So Hyuk was about to slam his head into the table, he heard a boy suddenly enter the classroom asking him to stop. As it turned out, it was Woo Jin, who was happy that he not only visited his new friend, but also met the hooligans who did not understand his words the first time. Seeing him at the door, the main bully among the younger classes, with a tremor running through his whole body, angrily pointed his finger at him, calling him the crazy one they had met yesterday. With an angry expression on his face, Woo Jin didn't even say anything but ordered those guys to follow him. The hooligans did not resist. They went out with him onto the roof of the school. In just a few minutes, a lot of onlookers had appeared at this place. This was necessary to confirm the position of the side that would win this conflict. Seeing that some senior had just called Soo Hyuk and his gang to a fight, the students thought that he was some kind of crazy person. Only Jae-min, who had already seen how this guy fought, understood perfectly well that it was not he who was in danger, but those who rushed towards him with a scream, succumbing to excessive emotions. Watching the futile attempts of some fool from a gang of local hooligans, Woo Jin only confirmed his suspicions that there are such people everywhere, no matter whether it is Earth or Alphen. So Hyuk, who rushed forward so desperately even though he couldn't even touch the enemy, was one of those who was full of arrogance due to strength or power. Seeing this impudent man, Woo Jin understood that he did not know his place, his behavior reminiscent of Cassis from the Alphen Union. As a bloodthirsty necromancer who only summoned the souls of sinners, he tried in every way to frame Woo Jin and set the alliance against him. Just like that disgusting scumbag from Alphen, So Hyuk also tried his best to hurt Woo Jin, but his own strength was not enough. Woo Jin had seen this pattern of behavior before and knew exactly what to expect next. As expected, So Hyuk's arrogance prevented him from falling into despair, so he immediately turned to his subordinates, forcing them to attack Woo Jin in a similar manner to how Cassis from the Alphen Alliance did. However, this was not a problem, because having superior strength, the high school student already remembered from his own experience that such people can only be dealt with by responding to them in the same way tenfold. Only by having overwhelming force can one not worry about the intentions of this or that arrogant, stuck-up bastard. None of these guys were a match for the senior, even though they kept the whole school in fear. Woo Jin had no problem treating everyone who wanted some of his father's bream. The educational moment with the followers of the school's main bully happened in a matter of seconds. Next came a tired, trembling boy who was destroyed by his own arrogance. Looking at So Hyuk, Woo Jin egged him on by appealing to his pride. Seo Hyuk couldn't stand this kind of treatment and desperately rushed into the attack. However, this time, Woo Jin wasn't going to play around with him and sent him to the others, lying on the ground with his body shaking from the blow he had taken. Addressing these bullies in front of the entire school, the senior put them in their place by telling them that they were too loud for simpletons. While looking at how the area had changed over the past 5 years, the high school student noticed a taxi rushing towards them. He froze in place when he saw who came out of it. A middle-aged woman ran quickly towards the school entrance in the middle of the school day. Woo Jin couldn't confuse her with anyone else, because even though 20 years had passed since his reincarnation in another world, his mother still looked the same. He ran to meet her without delay, and when they saw each other, they threw themselves into an embrace for several minutes. His mother was shaking with excitement, and tears were flowing like a stream. Even the cold-blooded Woo Jin, who had been through hell for the past 20 years, could hardly contain his emotions. After that, they started a long conversation, during which Woo Jin learned that right after he disappeared 5 Earth years ago, there was a dungeon strike all over the world, and the subway stations instantly became dungeons full of deadly monsters. By an unfortunate coincidence, his father died on his way to work, leaving his mother to take care of Soo-ae alone. Because their family was not well off, the family's financial situation quickly deteriorated when Soo-ah became seriously ill. From then on, every day of their life was like torture. When they returned home, the mother left her son alone, saying that she needed to go to kindergarten to pick up her daughter. Excited by this long-awaited meeting, Woo Jin could not collect his thoughts. To his regret, he returned to a different house than the one they had lived in before. Mom never told him what had happened to their home and how a high-rise building of some corporation had appeared in their place. However, As soon as he got to their new place of residence, a small, cramped apartment, he immediately felt how difficult it was for his mother to take care of the family alone. Just looking around the house, he immediately realized that such a family would not fit here. In one of the boxes by the wall were things from the previous house, things that belonged to him and his dad. Most likely, his mother simply could not throw away such valuable things associated with them. The realization of the reason why his mother couldn't throw them out made even his cold heart freeze immediately. An hour later, Mom and Sue returned home, and the little sister finally met her older brother. The shy little girl hid behind her mother, but her brother's smile inspired confidence in her. Sitting down opposite her, Woo Jin asked if she remembered him and how he changed her diapers when she was little. In response, Sue became embarrassed and said that she no longer peed. As it turned out, the mother had been working in a restaurant all this time, but for the first time in a long time, she took a day off to spend the day with her family after the return of her beloved son. The family atmosphere melted the cold ice in Woo Jin's heart, and he even played with his little sister before they had dinner. Night fell and they went to bed. However, Woo Jin couldn't fall asleep for a long time, thinking about what his family's life was like now. He understood that the world was no longer the same as before, and he also needed to change and adapt. 20 years ago, he was summoned by Alphen for no reason. That world looked more like a game than anything like Earth. Thrown into such a wild environment where everything around him was deadly, he fought harder than anyone to survive at any cost against the brutal monsters and creatures of Alphen. Finally, after many years of countless battles, he became a maximum-level necromancer, gaining unprecedented power. With no end in sight for his long journey, he returned to Earth after meeting with the spatial administrator, and he came all this way just to finally be reunited with his family, which he had never stopped thinking about all this time. He just wanted normal happiness, but the Earth he returned to had changed almost beyond recognition. Not only is there a new order with the dungeons and corporations, his father is dead, and his family is barely making ends meet. Woo Jin couldn't accept this. He had no other option but to earn a decent amount of money to support his family. As a survivor of Alphen, he had no doubt that he could overcome even worse if it was for his family, who had been waiting for him all this time. The next day, Woo Jin continued to get used to life in Seoul, which had changed significantly in the past 5 years. He now even had a phone, something he could only dream of in the past. While exploring the vastness of the internet, he constantly came across references to awakened people. Moreover, when he left the dungeon he had accidentally entered, the security guard was relieved to call him awakened. The confused man was scared to death, thinking that an ordinary civilian had entered the dungeon. The first thing he asked was why Woo Jin went there if there were no more bloodstones. Before Jin could say a word, he was forced to sign some papers and agreements stating that he had followed safety precautions. Based on his still poor understanding of the modern world, he assumed that he had a pretty good job. A way that will allow you to earn good money in a short period of time is to use your awakened status. For the first time of his work, he did not want to disturb his mother, so he wrote her a message that he knew a friend, that he lived alone, and agreed to accept him as a guest to prepare for the entrance exams. Although Woo Jin did feel a bit awkward about his importunity, he was still forced to turn to Do Jae-min again. However, when he called the number Jae-min left for him, he connected to the Dongjin District Employment Agency. Hearing the voice of the employee who identified himself as a representative of the agency, Woo Jin became confused and began to check the number. He didn't make any mistakes and entered all the numbers correctly, so there was no doubt that this was the same number. Only after confirming that he had indeed contacted an employment agency did Woo Jin realize that the cunning Jae-min had dared to deceive him out of fear of further extortion of money. In fact, Woo Jin understood his behavior because their acquaintance happened extremely strangely and he himself could not inspire any trust. On the other hand, Jae-min might even have regretted doing this because he never said thank you for the fact that Soo Hyuk and his gang wouldn't bother him anymore thanks to the high school student's actions. Returning to his apartment after much thought about this situation, he came to the conclusion that although Woo Jin looked like a psycho, he was definitely not a bad guy. In addition, there was no need to worry about him anymore, since he was able to meet and talk to his mother. However, when Jae-min returned and entered his apartment, something unexpected happened. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice welcoming him home. Jae-min was startled to see Woo Jin sitting at the table, eating tangerines and watching TV. His first panicked question was how he managed to get inside. As it turned out, he had seen Jae-min type in the password to enter the house earlier. Although he could be praised for his phenomenal memory, his new friend from elementary school was not so happy and said that it could be considered breaking and entering. However, when Woo Jin mentioned that he had called him but someone else had picked up, all the complaints disappeared due to the guilt he felt about the deception. Seeing Jae-min's awkwardness, Woo Jin decided to put himself in his shoes and change the topic, asking if he would mind answering a few questions for him. Within a moment, the conversation took on a completely different emotion, because Jae-min had discovered the truth about Woo Jin being an awakened person. Now everything fell into place for him, because he had already observed how amazing the strength of this high school student was. The first question that interested Woo Jin was how much money the people who awakened after the dungeons appeared made. Without thinking twice, Jae-min confirmed his suspicions, clarifying that it usually depended on how difficult the dungeon was. According to him, Woo Jin is not yet qualified to participate in clearing, so he first needs to register as an awakened in the association to obtain a license to enter dungeons, and then he will have to join a guild for team raiding. Alternatively, he could also get a job in an association or an administrative bureau, but Woo Jin, understanding how team cleansing works, was right when he decided that it was more profitable to work alone, for himself. However, in Jae-min's opinion, it was not that simple. He suggested avoiding the risk and joining a guild, since fighting alone was too dangerous, especially for a high school student. However, Woo Jin did not listen to his words. He understood that guilds require entrance tests, which he did not have time for. He did not pay attention to this risk, justifying his decision by saying that he urgently needed money. Realizing that arguing with him was simply useless, Jae-min suggested that he at least form a group, since the dungeons were indeed very dangerous, and many of the awakened were never able to rise outside. Remembering that he had a phone, his friend suggested that he download an app. It was clear from Woo Jin's expression that he had no idea what this was all about, so the more modern Jae-min took his phone to help with the matter. When Jae-min picked up the phone, he showed surprise that he was holding such an old model. When he suggested that it was used by someone in his family, Woo Jin awkwardly replied that it was a new model. He was truly furious when he found out that this mobile had been on the market for 4 years, which meant that the seller had cheated him by selling it as new. The cheeky owner of a small shop convinced him that it was the best-selling phone at the time, being a long-lasting model used by a huge number of famous awakened people. While Woo Jin was dreaming about how he would beat all the bad manners out of that salesman, Jae-min managed to enter the dungeon forum with the help of a slow technological device, and said that one could find information about dungeons there and reserve them in advance. Woo Jin thought that he was now ready to earn all the money in the world, but his ardor was dampened by the reminder that he needed to attain the awakened rank first. Moreover, Jae-min was sure that he would simply die if he rushed into the first dungeon without discrimination. When the old phone was returned to its owner, the truth about the entrance fee was also revealed. Jae-min clarified that when it comes to the entrance fee, it is important to know that even for low-level dungeons, you will need to pay 10,000 won. The issue of money, as usual, continued to be acute and problematic. There was silence, which was broken by an appeal to Jae-min. After this, a very obvious event happened. Woo Jin again asked Jae-min to lend him money. On the advice of his friend, Woo Jin went to the Awakened Administration Bureau the next day. In the Awakened examination room, he showed off his strength without hiding anything. The judges present could not contain their surprise when they saw the black aura emanating from the high school student. They didn't yet understand what was happening, but everything became clear when the guy pointed his hand to the side, controlling this aura. Nearby lay the body of a rabbit, which was necessary for using his necromancy skill. Even though the rabbit was not a monster, even such a weak creature was suitable for turning into part of his army. In front of everyone present, Woo Jin used necromancy magic, and after his dark aura and the rabbit's body came into contact, a skeleton soldier appeared and kicked the floor, breaking the tiles. The fact that he shocked all the judges could be judged by the fact that they could not utter a word. Even though the skeleton was summoned using the corpse of a weak animal, its powers were comparable to at least an ordinary person. Seeing their reactions, Woo Jin was in anticipation of receiving a decent rank. With only one skeleton, he felt extremely confident, realizing that necromancy was a very rare and truly powerful magic. His only warrior gave off quite an impressive aura, even though he was only a beginner level. The judges said with surprise that his powers were truly amazing. They had indeed seen a lot here over the past 5 years, but this was the first time they had met a user of necromancy. Summoners' abilities are judged by the combat abilities of the familiars they summon, so it was common practice to use copies of goblins to test Wu Jin's strength. Seeing the use of a hologram that had a physical form, Wu Jin couldn't help but be amazed at how far technological advancement had come since the blood crystals appeared in his home world. This looked pretty cool, as it greatly simplified the process of testing the skills of new recruits. Wu Jin immediately ordered his familiar to charge in and show his power. The skeleton obeyed the order without question and destroyed the goblin in an instant. Despite his abilities being truly unique, he was left disappointed with his license upon completion of the test. Wu Jin was given an F rank, and when asked if that was a high rank, he was gently informed that it was actually reserved for the weakest awakened. As expected, the summoned familiar's power was weaker than they expected, however. In turn, the judges tried to calm the awakened one by saying that since it was a unique ability, there was no doubt that he would easily find a party for himself. Still, Wu Jin wasn't too upset, thinking that he didn't care about the rank as long as he could enter the dungeon. Having obtained the license, he immediately went to the nearest point, which turned out to be Silim Station. The dungeon rank was estimated at 2 stars, and quite a lot of novice awakened warriors with fairly good equipment had already gathered here. One of the awakened, who was not going into the dungeon for the first time with his group, when he saw a newcomer standing alone, asked if he wanted to join their squad. There were 7 of them, and the guy with green hair said that they still had some free space for him. However, Wu Jin refused his offer, saying that he could handle it himself. The green-haired stranger was surprised and replied that he didn't see the point in spending so much money to enter, since he would hardly be able to carry many bloodstones due to the time limit. When he saw the surprise on Wu Jin's face, he immediately realized that he had only recently become a minor and did not yet know all the nuances. The next question was what rank the curious boy was. After learning that Wu Jin was only an F rank, the green-haired awakened believed in himself and that he could be manipulated. As an experienced E-rank minor, he assumed that Wu Jin still didn't know much, so he should treat his first trip as an experience by joining their party. In return, he would guarantee his safety. While Wu Jin was thinking about his proposal, those wishing to enter the dungeon began to slowly descend. Looking at Do Su, who was calmly discussing the weather and such things with his guys, Wu Jin began to reason about how the entry fee was indeed calculated for the maximum number of participants, and it would be too expensive for a single person. According to Do Su, the maximum number of participants at the entrance is 8, and to enter alone, you need to pay for 8 at once, a whopping 800,000 won. His words about how it is better to go in a group to mine stones effectively seemed to be the obvious truth. Wu Jin decided to listen to his advice, because the idea of going in a group wasn't that bad, because it would be nice to get some information about the process first. Suddenly, he was distracted by a strange young man who looked rather nervous. He assumed that Wu Jin was also nervous about entering this dungeon. When the necromancer replied that a man should not show fear, even if he was afraid, the intrusive stranger laughed awkwardly, saying that he liked this confidence. Hong Sung-gu turned out to be the same F-rank fighter. This fire mage was recruited in the same way as Wu Jin. It seems he awakened 2 months ago, after which he left school and began to earn money as an awakened. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted when they heard a noise at the entrance of the dungeon. 4 people came out, all of them quite seriously injured, which only increased Song-gu's anxiety. The trembling boys who had emerged shocked everyone present with their sudden announcement that there was a hobgoblin in that subway, a monster that shouldn't be in such low-level dungeons. Seeing his team's anxiety, Do Su calmed them down by telling them that there was no point in worrying as it was just a waste of time. Addressing the new recruits who had joined his small party, he said that sometimes there were monsters in the dungeons that weren't supposed to be there. He believed that the hobgoblin was only a 2-star monster that they could easily deal with if they were careful enough. Having calmed his comrades, the squad captain suggested going down into the dungeon. From the very beginning, they were met by low-level monsters, which was to be expected in such a place. Upon seeing the ordinary goblins, Song-gu immediately used his fire magic. His fireball was quite a formidable weapon for such weaklings, so he could destroy multiple enemies at once in one attack. The squad leader's fire magic turned out to be more sophisticated. Using burning, the mage Do-su could stop multiple targets at once, depriving them of sight or the ability to breathe. The teamwork of his squad was well practiced. Without waiting for orders, his comrades from the warrior class rushed to the attack. The goblins, who could not see anything, could not resist and became easy targets for these guys. Wu Jin acted alone in his usual manner, using his beginner-level familiar, which easily overcame obstacles in the form of goblins. After the first wave was easily destroyed, Wu Jin took the opportunity to praise Sun Gu's skills, saying that his fire spells were quite powerful. In turn, the rest of the squad admitted that the skeleton summoned by the necromancer was faster than it seemed at first glance. In addition, in their opinion, it seemed quite strong. No one doubted that it was definitely higher than rank F. There was nothing strange about it, because Wu Jin actually spent the remaining points to raise the skill level. Looking at his creation, he was convinced that it was worth it. Meanwhile, Do-su began to check the loot. While collecting bloodstones, he found that the 2-star dungeons had some pretty good loot. Wu Jin became even more interested when he heard that one bloodstone would cost around 200,000 won. Hearing that even such a small mana crystal had such a hefty price tag, Wu Jin understood why awakened ones were risking their lives instead of doing their usual things. Now it became clear that the 100,000 won entrance fee was just a pittance compared to the profit. They were only at the very beginning of the dungeon, but they had already made a pretty good profit. The group leader's greed began to rapidly increase due to the realization that the 1-star dungeons were nowhere near as good as the quality of the loot. Looking at another good bloodstone, he had no doubt that he had found a real gold mine. The squad continued clearing the dungeon and easily reached the last floor, where they had to give it their all for a worthy reward. When they got down to the top floor, they were surprised that the monsters did not attack them. Their worst fears turned out to be true because the guys who entered the dungeon before them did not break the news about the hobgoblin being here. Seeing panic begin to spread among the team members, Do-su asked the guys to calm down, saying that everything was fine and they would be able to overcome this obstacle using the normal formation. Wu Jin, who had been constantly improving his leadership skills for the past 20 years, did not understand Do-su's intentions. In response to his words, he asked whether it would not be better to act a little more cautiously than he suggested. Despite Wu Jin's attempt, he still did not give up on the idea of acting according to his strategy, saying that he had studied the manual for fighting the hobgoblin in advance, learning that its main attack was magic. The overconfident E-rank mage thought of defensive measures for the team, using the ability of one of them who had the ability to create barriers. The leader believed that if they blocked the first attack and got closer, then victory would be assured. Despite his experience, which literally screamed at him that everything was not so simple, Wu Jin decided not to argue with the team leader, because his guys were under his personal responsibility. As expected, the fearsome hobgoblin greeted them using magic. Seeing him raise his magic cane, Do-su immediately shouted at his comrade to immediately use magic to block the attack. This guy's barrier was unique, so it didn't matter what kind of magic he encountered. The hobgoblin turned out to be a user of lightning magic, but its power was not enough to destroy the magician's defense. Having repelled the enemy's first attack, Do-su ordered the boys to go on the offensive. First of all, the team leader blinded the enemy by using the hobgoblin's eye burn. Within a moment, the warriors using swords rushed to attack, but the second-level monster stubbornly blocked the close attacks. Sun Gu joined them, directing his fireball spell at the hobgoblin. It seemed like everything was going according to the team leader's plan, but Wu Jin clearly saw that they were already in danger. Among the monsters he encountered on Alphen were hobgoblins. Compared to ordinary goblins, these guys had high intelligence, which became clear when the enemy cast a spell. Based on his experience, Wu Jin knew better than anyone that the real danger of this beginner-level monster was not its magic. While fighting the hobgoblin, the boys completely forgot about where the small goblins had disappeared to. As it turned out, they hid on the floor and even armed themselves with improvised means, and their look and behavior suddenly changed. With a tremor in his voice, one of the team members said that those guys were different from what they had seen before. Taking advantage of the situation, one of the goblins secretly fired a dart from around the corner at one of the squad members. His victim was a warrior in armor, the dart hitting him right in the neck. His whole body became paralyzed and he began to tremble from unbearable pain. A moment later, he received a sudden blow to the back of the head and fell to the ground. The goblins acted quietly and covertly. It was clear that they could deal with the entire team if they did not take action. Watching the pathetic actions of the guys from the squad he agreed to go with, Wu Jin said that this was exactly what he was afraid of. The cocky Do Su didn't seem like someone who wanted to listen to some new recruit among the awakened. Wu Jin knew from the very meeting that the real danger of the hobgoblins was not their magic or brute strength, but their ability to lead due to their comparatively high intelligence. The goblin squad leader is not just another one-star monster, but a true leader of the army, who is capable of using various tactics and even giving personal orders to each subordinate. Realizing that the guys couldn't cope with the panic, and the situation was getting worse with every second, Do Su made an adequate decision for the first time. He shouted that they should retreat and get out of this place as soon as possible. All the fighters immediately ran towards the exit, without looking back at the monsters. Only Wu Jin and Sun Gu stood in their place, diligently covering the backs of their comrades. Using fire magic, he continued to strike, losing most of his mana reserves. However, now using the means at hand, the goblins were able to withstand his attacks and continue their advance. Addressing the others, Do Su stated that they were no match for this enemy, so they should retreat immediately. When one of his bewildered comrades asked what they would do with Zhang Chul, who had suffered from 2 surprise attacks, the leader shouted that he was beyond help. Without even trying to help their friend, they cowardly ran towards the exit. However, the hobgoblin was not willing to stop the fun. He was delighted with how well his players had performed. Having accumulated enough mana, he directed lightning magic towards the fleeing boys. The blow was accurate. The hobgoblin aimed it at the most diligent of the fighters. Songgu, who was too careless, was hit by this magical attack. The boy began to fall to the ground, and the leader, despite his condition, did not change tactics. They continued to run towards the exit. The boys began to move away to a safe distance, and the goblins decided to stop pursuing them, being satisfied with such prey. When everyone had fled, the wounded Songgu, lying on the ground, was left to be torn apart by the goblins and their leader. The only one who didn't chicken out was the most experienced and quiet among the awakened Wu Jin. Taking out his favorite weapon, a crowbar found in the subway, from his inventory, he began to slowly walk towards the goblins, saying that he had not hunted such enemies for a long time. Using his power, Wu Jin summoned 4 fighters who could easily replace the cowards who fled as soon as they sensed danger. Realizing that the battle was not yet over, the hobgoblin immediately ordered his army to continue the offensive. Analyzing the situation and referring to his experience, Wu Jin came to the conclusion that it would be difficult to deal with goblins under the command of a hobgoblin. Based on this, he decided to make an unexpected move and rushed into the vanguard himself, heading towards the strongest enemy, the goblins, whose instincts and will belonged entirely to their leader, fearlessly rushed into a frontal attack. Within a moment they were stopped and busy fighting the necromancer's familiars. While the skeletons were fighting the goblins, Wu Jin could fight their leader without fear. Seeing a human next to him, the hobgoblin began to release lightning magic, pointing his cane at the enemy. Wu Jin had calculated from the very beginning the time it would take for the enemy to carry out such an attack. A moment later, he dealt a fatal blow to his opponent. With a sly smile on his face, he asked the hobgoblin if he really thought he would politely wait for him to finish casting his ridiculous spell. Due to the enemy's rather low level, his actions were quite predictable, and dealing with him alone was not particularly difficult. After defeating the strongest monster in this dungeon, Wu Jin received a level-up message. As soon as he raised his level to the 6th, he immediately felt the increase in characteristics. Having received a lot of experience for destroying the enemy on his own, he was only convinced that fighting on his own is much better and more fun than with a group of losers. Suddenly, he was distracted by some groans, and looking around, he saw Songgu lying on the ground, trembling in pain. Wu Jin was surprised that he was still alive, and in response, he heard a desperate, weakened plea for help. He had no particular reason to help the stranger, but he still decided to make contact with the poor fellow. Sitting down next to him, he asked what would happen to him if he saved him. In response, Songgu said in a trembling voice that he would not tell anyone that he was actually a D-rank fighter, not an F-rank fighter. The dying boy's words seemed like complete nonsense, and even Wu Jin was surprised by their stupidity. Wu Jin knew that this guy could be useful, so he thought about what he could ask for in return. With a sly smile, he said that 2 would be enough. His suggestion was made so carefully that the dying man could not even make out what was being said. Despite the unclear conditions, they managed to reach an agreement. After Wu Jin saved this wounded poor guy, he gave him a completely fair task. Songgu personally extracted all the mana crystals from the bodies of the dead goblins. Using this boy's labor, Wu Jin managed to obtain a backpack almost full of precious materials. After finishing the job, Songgu, who was staring at his savior, could not stop thinking about how he was given the lowest rank. After seeing it in action, he immediately realized that even without using the power of a necromancer, he could hunt 2-star monsters, which immediately made him a D-rank hunter. In addition, his familiars, the skeletons, were also of particular interest, each of whom was stronger than the guys they came with. In front of this fire mage, he even demonstrated the use of the search skill to find bloodstones and more. No less surprising was the fact that in order to save the poor guy, he used some unique magic, pumping out the last of the life from the monsters. Taking all this into account, he could already be assigned a C rank. And another shocking fact was that Wu Jin had previously reported that he had registered as a hunter only 3 hours ago. Taking back his backpack, which was overflowing with precious materials, Wu Jin learned that he would receive approximately 800,000 won for all of this. Looking at the trophies, he admitted that it was not bad considering he only paid 100,000 won for entry. Looking greedily at the poor fellow, he put him in an awkward position, warning him that all the loot belonged only to him. Wu Jin's obsession with money really scared Songgu, but despite this, he was glad that he was able to save his life with 2 million. Having finished collecting the mana crystals, the guys went to pick up the return stone. Suddenly, Wu Jin felt a slight thirst for blood, causing him to stop and ask his new comrade to wait at a safe distance. It was difficult to see where the danger was coming from at first glance, but Wu Jin was sure that an enemy ambush was waiting for them ahead. Looking around, he made sure that there were no more monsters here. Based on this, it became clear that the problem was with those scumbags who abandoned them to their fate. When Wu Jin shouted for them to finally show themselves, the cowards hesitantly took a few steps out of the shadows. After going down, Dosu decided not to show that he was planning something vile, and was only surprised that the 2 of them were able to defeat all the enemies. Seeing that Songgu didn't fully understand the situation, Wu Jin warned him that if they came any closer, those scumbags would deal them a vile blow. Looking in their direction, he himself did not know what to do with them, so he decided that it would be a good idea to start a conversation. Turning to the scum, he asked how they dared to appear before them so shamefully after they had vilely fled from the battlefield, leaving their comrades to die. Moreover, he immediately pointed out the strangeness in their behavior, namely, that if they really decided to escape from the dungeon, they should have stayed at the barrier, without returning to the lower floors. Trying to defend themselves from the direct hints that they were traitors, the group leader said with a stupid laugh that there was no need to accuse his teammates so rudely. With a false air of friendliness in his gestures, he tried to justify himself by saying that they had simply returned to clear the dungeon after a tactical retreat. According to him, they were very surprised that all the monsters had already been destroyed by that time. Looking at the backpack overflowing with crystals, he asked with a sly smile how they managed to defeat such a serious opponent. Wu Jin had no intention of playing his dirty games, and said in a serious tone that they should not delay their vile plan. Taking off his backpack with precious materials that most likely interested the leader of their group, he assumed that those naive fools wanted to run away after receiving the return stones. But now they saw that everything was cleared out here, and the money itself was coming to meet them. A moment later, he scattered all the mana crystals onto the ground and was met with stunned looks from part of the group who did not expect such an act. With a menacing look, Wu Jun said in all seriousness that if they wanted his trophies so much, then they should try to take at least one of them for themselves. However, even after such high-quality manipulation, Dosu continued to try to convey a different opinion to him. He repeated with a ridiculous smile that there had been a misunderstanding, justifying his words by saying that they were not so stupid as to attack someone who had killed monsters that they could not do anything against, even with the help of coordinated work. He apologized for them leaving him and Sungu behind, justifying this act by saying that their lives were at stake and something like this could be expected. He explained the return back by saying that they simply returned for the return stones, and now, seeing that the path was cleared, they could even thank him for giving them the opportunity to take John Chul's body. Seeing how stubbornly leader Do-Su continued to justify his behavior, Wu Jin began to doubt his guesses. The green-haired guy, although he was fond of jewelry, still looked quite sincere. Sighing heavily, he decided that he had simply gone too far, confusing the premonition of the monsters with an ambush. Based on this, he assumed that during those 20 years spent in Alphen, he had become too nervous and distrustful, which even affected his attitude towards people like him after his return. In just a moment, he was confronted with the reality that he had begun to deny a few seconds ago. He felt a sudden, intense burning sensation in his eye area, which was used on him by a fire magic user, the leader of their group, Do-Su. Song-gu was shocked by what was happening, and, staring at his savior, did not even have time to react to the fact that those scoundrels received the order to begin the attack. A moment later, a magic arrow flew at the poor guy and hit him in the left shoulder. Song-gu screamed in pain as Wu Jin began to get his bearings, resigning himself to the fact that he had to fight. He saw Do-Su rush at him with a knife, shouting furiously that he shouldn't hold a grudge against him for this. In an instant, he appeared right in front of Wu Jin and dealt him a vile blow to the stomach. Meanwhile, in some other dungeon, another raid was successfully completed, because the main team of one of the most serious guilds of Seoul was responsible for it. The guys were well equipped, moreover. They even had a truck that transported all their gear. Not only the logistics, but also the teamwork was almost perfect. One could envy the way they supported each other after a successful raid. Their pleasant conversation was interrupted by a phone call. The team leader, who is the same red-haired girl we met earlier, took a call in which she was informed that the second unexpected intruder who entered their property had been found. It was about Wu Jin, and Yoon-hee couldn't help but be surprised when she learned that although they didn't have any information on him, they did have information that today was the first time he appeared in the database after registering with the Awakened Alliance. Of course, the team leader wanted to know immediately where he was at that moment in order to have a clearing conversation with him. She had no idea what kind of trouble he had gotten himself into on the very first day of his awakened career. Back to those events, the vile and disgusting Do-Su had already stabbed Wu Jin, and after his knife stopped, he began to look into his eyes with curiosity, expecting to see a reaction to pain in them. He was simply shocked when he saw that instead of the expected reaction, he began to laugh maliciously, saying that he was surprised by such insolence. As it turned out, not only did Wu Jin manage to get his bearings, he also blocked that sneaky blow by grabbing the attacker's arm. He held his arm so tightly that Do-Su began to tremble from the sharp pain, similar to a broken bone. He no longer had time to talk. He threw the attacker to the ground with brute force, and he didn't even have time to notice how it happened. Do-Su broke the floor with his own body and began to scream in incredible pain. While adjusting his long hair, Wu Jin asked with an evil expression if he really believed that he could carry out such a vile plan. There were only a few scratches on his face, and his eyes were intact, since he had managed to use the mana aura. Pointing his finger at the other bastards who dared to challenge him, he asked if it was true what they said about all the awakened beings being the same as them. Looking at the shameless traitors blinded by the bloodstones, he shocked those guys by using necromancy on the goblin corpses lying next to them, calling for reinforcements in the form of 5 skeletons that outnumbered the attackers in strength. He declared that it was time for punishment, and then ordered them to get rid of the scoundrels. Within a moment, all the members of the group were exterminated right before the eyes of their leader, who watched helplessly while lying on the ground. Wu Jin didn't intend to waste much time on them, so he reached for the knife that Do-Su had dropped. Walking slowly towards the leader of the group, accompanied by the shouts of the other fighters, he looked him coldly in the eyes, making it clear that it was all over for him. Injured after being thrown so hard to the ground, Do-Su was in a panic, and he hoarsely shouted that he was suggesting that they just talk to avoid violence. With a wild look, Wu Jin asked him in return if he wanted to stall for time so that the delay in using his skill would pass. A moment later, Dosu joined his comrades and departed for the next world. After dealing with the vile members of the hunting party, Wu Jin did not miss the opportunity to check the pockets of their leader, expecting that he should have a lot of money. Wounded in the shoulder, Songgu, who witnessed this cruel spectacle, could not believe his eyes and the cold-bloodedness with which his savior dealt with the attackers. After eliminating 5 people in an instant, Wu Jin said that these bastards were useless anyway, and then asked his new friend if he agreed with his words. Looking around, he asked why he couldn't even find the words to somehow respond to his question. Songgu was shaking from fear and pain from his injury. He said with great difficulty in a weakened voice that Wu Jin was absolutely right. Having finished his business, Wu Jin came closer to him and, putting his hands on his hips, stated the fact that he was in danger for the 2nd time in a row. Speaking of this, he shocked Songgu by saying that because of this, he would have to pay double. There was nothing to explain here. Songgu himself understood that he had been saved twice and was now in infinite debt to this madman. Ignoring the attackers lying nearby, Wu Jin treated Songgu's wounds for the 2nd time, giving him first aid. Thus, the raid was completely over, and when they came out of the dungeon, the representative of the alliance controlling this station could not understand why he saw only 2 members of the group, which consisted of 8 people. When asked why there were only 2 of them, Wu Jin calmly replied that all of their other comrades had been killed by monsters that were much stronger than they had expected. This information was not only shocking, but also suspicious. The Soul Hunter Alliance representative, noticing the overflowing backpack on the awakened man's back, asked how they were able to collect all those bloodstones. Looking at his backpack, which was indeed suspicious, Wu Jin answered without hesitation that even though they were facing a serious threat, it still didn't stop them from collecting all the trophies so as not to leave the money lying on the ground. Having no other choice, the representative of the Hunters Alliance handed him a statement and a pen, asking him to sign before leaving, since there was a chance that the Bureau would contact him to clarify the details of this incident. Having finished with these nuances, Wu Jin, together with his friend, who was afraid to even move in his presence, immediately went to the mana crystal collection point. When he sold all the trophies, he walked out of that building with a sly, satisfied smile. He had never imagined that he could get more than 13 million won in one raid. As he continued to walk with a mad expression on his face, he was also smug about the fact that to that amount, he should also add the bonus 4 million that he would soon receive from Songgu as payment for saving him. He once again confirmed his suspicions that it was worth continuing to clear the dungeons himself in order to maximize the financial benefits from the campaigns. Even though he had escaped twice from situations where his life seemed to be on the line, Songgu was deeply troubled, knowing that there was no escape from this guy. The sum of 4 million won was becoming increasingly more worrying to him, because even with his savings, he was not enough to give it all at once. He was already wondering whether he could try to lower the price for his rescue, and whether they would give him a loan for such an amount, without any adequate explanation for such a financial need. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted as soon as Wu Jin spoke to him. Turning towards him, he reminded him with the same crazy expression on his face that he had already seen that he really didn't like those people who tried to stab him in the back. After this warning that made Songgu's blood run cold, Wu Jin bid him farewell, saying that he would look forward to his call regarding payment for his life-saving services. It seemed like Songgu should have felt some relief when Wu Jin left, but instead, he went into an even greater state of shock as he wondered what amount of money they were talking about. He couldn't tell if they were talking about 4 million won or 400 million won. The uncontrollable series of funny events did not stop at this point. The working day of the owner of a small mobile equipment store was already nearing its end. His business was not in the best condition. There were few customers, and among them there were not even 10 buyers, so he yawned out of boredom, waiting for the end of the working day. Suddenly he felt an inexplicable pressure, followed by the loud opening of the front door. He was simply shocked that some madman was entering his shop, opening its glass doors with a brutal kick. It was Wu Jin, and it was obvious that he was far from being in the best mood, and was not in the mood to negotiate with this blond man. Wu Jin slowly walked up to the salesman and grabbed him by the crib, then lifted him into the air with just one hand. The salesman was scared to death. He was angry at the same time, not understanding what was happening. Due to the small number of customers, he could not afford a contract with a security service, and seeing this madman, he trembled with fear, wondering why he was so strong. He didn't even have time to utter a word before he suddenly received a lightning-fast and incredibly painful slap in the face. He angrily shouted what he was even allowing himself to do. The seller hoped that he would be able to put him in his place. For the first time in his life, he made such a gross mistake, because instead of trying to find out the reason for the discontent of such an angry visitor, he provoked his anger and another portion of slaps. The seller barely had time to breathe in air. He could not comprehend what was happening, fearing that if this continued for a few more minutes, he might even die. His face began to swell, and he thought that this was what he had recently seen on TV. He could think of nothing else but to assume that this was called indiscriminate rape. With a trembling voice, he began to beg for mercy. Looking at this poor guy, Wu Jin wondered if greeting the impudent guy like that was enough for him to realize the seriousness of his intentions. His mood was not so bad, so he did not refuse the seller's request, and instead of continuing to beat him with slaps, he simply threw him on the floor. When Wu Jin approached this phone store owner, he immediately knelt down in front of him and cried out pitifully that he would do whatever he asked of him. In response, Wu Jin conveyed to him the words that he truly hated people who stab him in the back, as well as people who try to deceive him. The seller could not understand what kind of knife in the back he was talking about, and what he meant when he spoke about the deception he accused him of. Seeing the bewilderment of the beaten scoundrel, Wu Jin took out of his pocket the phone that the seller sold him, saying that it was the latest model. Upon seeing this outdated model, the beaten swindler immediately remembered that this was the very same device that he had managed to successfully sell to some simpleton. Not only did he sell that phone by telling him it was the latest model, he also convinced him it was an incredible deal by selling it at the price of really good new ones. At that moment, Wu Jin was truly perceived as a simpleton, because when he picked up this device, after staying in Alphen for 20 years, he was incredibly delighted. He even happily said that he couldn't believe how far technology had come in the last 5 years. Seeing the angry look of this guy, the seller remembered that it was he who became the victim of his fraud. Everything fell into place. The man, scared to death, had no choice but to correct the situation to his own detriment. On his way home, Wu Jin was enjoying his new phone. As expected, he was delighted with this device, which was indeed much better than the previous one. He still doubted whether he had done the right thing with the seller, because if they were in Alphen, he would have lost his tongue. Suddenly, some men in suits appeared behind him and addressed him by his full name. Wu Jin stopped, seeing that he was surrounded by some strange guys. The red-haired stranger began to describe his dossier in detail, including information from the Hunter Alliance and even information about him clearing out the Guachian station single-handedly, indicating that he was much higher than F rank. She also didn't forget to mention that he was suspected of killing his teammates. Looking at this guy she had just met for the first time, Yoon-hee boldly asked if he was too fearless for a newbie. In response, Wu Jin asked who she was and why she was so interested in him. Unexpectedly for everyone, the leader of the hunting team behaved extremely unusually, politely apologizing for her manners. After that, she confidently introduced herself as the leader of the Cinnabar group from the Hwarang Guild. For Wu Jin, this meant practically nothing. He still didn't know how things were at the top of the guilds, and who among them could be considered truly dangerous. However, for his own good, he decided to check why she was so confident. Using the detection skill, he easily determined that this bold woman had truly impressive strength. Continuing the conversation, he asked her why she had found him. In response, Lee Yoon-hee mysteriously said that some rat was fearlessly roaming around the dungeons of her guild, believing that he would go unpunished for it. Realizing that it was him who was being called Krisa, Wu Jin smiled slyly. Looking around, he laughed at Yoon-hee's words, asking if their guild had really brought so many people just for the sake of one rat. Continuing his mockery, he said that since they were willing to bring so many people for him alone, it meant that Hwarang was a very large guild. Just as he was about to say that their dungeon he had recently entered was miserable, his speech was suddenly interrupted. One of the hunters was next to him in an instant and grabbed his face with his hand. Wu Jin didn't even have time to do anything before the red-haired guy in the black tuxedo threw him to the ground with great force. After that, the hunter from the Hwarang Guild warned him that he should watch his language, because for insulting their guild, he would feel its real wrath. Although the blow looked impressive, Wu Jin was not particularly hurt, but his anger flared up from the insolent treatment of his face. The attacker didn't even have time to notice how Wu Jin grabbed his hand. Gripping his stock tightly, he rose to his feet in an instant and made him scream in pain, squeezing almost to the point of breaking bones. It was obvious that this guy, who was called a rat when they met, was capable of dealing with these hunters. Yun-hee understood this very well. She could not allow anyone from her team to suffer from the actions of a guy who got on their nerves. In just a moment, she took a lightning-fast step and delivered a powerful kick to Wu Jin's stomach, so strong that he flew to the side. When he hit the ground, he still didn't understand how it happened. Opening his eyes after falling, he saw that Yun-hee was next to him again and raised her leg high. In an instant, she kicked him in the face so hard that the asphalt beneath him began to crumble. For the first time since returning to Earth, Kang Wu Jin encountered an opponent so strong that he was also fast enough that his reflexes were insufficient for combat. Putting her foot on his face, the arrogant woman said she was impressed by his strength. Still, she suggested he listen to her advice, saying that although he didn't look like a normal F rank, even with such skills, he shouldn't get cocky. Naturally, the point was that he would not be able to act arbitrarily on their territory with impunity. As she left, she looked again at the beaten Wu Jin lying on the asphalt and said that if he wanted to live longer, he should not forget her words. Fortunately, that was the end of it, and the team representatives left him in the same place. When it was all over, Wu Jin touched his face, which hurt from being treated so disrespectfully. He didn't feel any humiliation or anything like that, realizing that he wasn't in the best shape right now. Moreover, he was even genuinely surprised that for the first time in a long time, he had lost a battle without a chance. After such an unexpected warm meeting, Lee Yun-hee became very interested in him, and when he told Jae-min about this meeting, he was shocked to the limit. When Wu Jin asked him if she was really a famous person, he said with great emotion that she was one of the 10 awakened of their country who had an A rank. As for the Hwarang Guild, it turned out that it was in the top 3 along with the Hammer and KH. According to him, they all have great influence in politics and economics. Shocked by what he heard, Jae-min asked what his ridiculous protector had done in the first dungeon, that they paid such special attention to him. Wu Jin was extremely dissatisfied with such a tone and answered him insolently. He said that his weakling friend should watch his language, because in fact, if he wanted, he could beat even the Hwarang army, but after he regained his strength. In response to his words, Jae-min even began to laugh, saying that the pride of a guy with an F rank was simply amazing. However, Wu Jin couldn't help but agree with his words, knowing that he would definitely be at a disadvantage if he fought someone outside the dungeon, even if they were high level. In addition, the necromancy skill itself was not unlimited, as it required corpses. The silence was broken when he handed Jae-min a bag containing some rather expensive famous perfume. The hint that he smelled bad was interrupted by the return of the money he had borrowed from him for a while. Seeing the impressive amount in front of him, Jae-min began to feel awkward and asked him to give back as much as he took, saying that he had already helped him a lot. When Wu Jin began to insist that he not refuse his gratitude, Jae-min was genuinely touched by his attitude. With a sly smile, the high school student added that if it was convenient for him, then he should consider the rest to be payment for living together in his apartment. Jae-min agreed with his words, but in an instant, he broke out in a cold sweat, realizing what his words really meant. He realized that Wu Jin was gently hinting to him that he was going to continue living with him. Trying to understand the reason for this behavior, he mentioned that he had recently met his mother. Wu Jin immediately understood what was going on, so he gave a direct answer that her house was too small, and he wanted to stay at his place until he could buy a new place. As an awkward pause ensued, Wu Jin became a little flustered by his only friend's words, and assumed that he had given too little money. In response, Jae-min reassured him that there was no problem. Before finishing his speech, he noticed that Wu Jin had changed his phone number. He was genuinely surprised, saying that this was the first time he had seen this latest model among his friends, which was in some sense a technological breakthrough. When he asked to look at the phone, Wu Jin breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the salesman had understood his request correctly this time. Jae-min was actually delighted with this device, especially the color, which was called Crazy Red. According to him, to make such a device, you need bloodstones, which is why the Crazy Red phone also becomes crazy expensive. Realizing this, Jae-min assumed that his friend really earned a lot, but his friend replied that he got it as a result of an event. His words sounded mysterious, but he didn't want to scare his friend by mentioning that this was an event in which the life of the salesman who had cheated him on the previous deal was at stake. Jae-min did not hide his admiration and even called his new friend a really cool guy. Suddenly, a message regarding a money transfer came on his phone, and Jae-min began to count the number of zeros with difficulty. Wu Jin immediately took his phone back and looked at the account where another 40 million won had appeared from Hong Sung-gu, and he realized that the idiot had mixed something up, because originally it was about 4 million. He had no choice but to contact him and arrange a meeting. When Sun-gu arrived at the said cafe, he greeted Wu Jin respectfully, calling him boss and politely asking how he was doing. In response, Wu Jin asked in confusion why all this speech was necessary when they had just met a few hours ago. After these words, he extended his phone towards him, asking what this bank transfer amount meant. With a clear tone of condemnation, he asked the poor fellow if he considered him some kind of beggar since he had sent such a sum. Then he reminded him of his words about 4. Sun-gu froze for a moment, realizing that he had paid. Remembering what he saw in the dungeon, he began to think that if he couldn't pay, he would end up in the place of those guys who crossed them. Now he began to think that we were talking about those same 4, not millions, but hundreds of millions. He couldn't even imagine how to get such a sum in such a short period of time, so he couldn't find a better option than to fall on his knees and start pitifully begging for his life. Wu Jin felt extremely awkward at this sudden sight, while Sun-gu, who had misunderstood his words, desperately shouted that he would give up the remaining portion if he was given a little more time. The behavior of this ridiculous awakened one attracted the attention of everyone present in this cafe, so Wu Jin began to get angry and nervously said that if he wanted to live, then he should first sit at the table with him. Sun-gu followed his order without question, and then began to make excuses that he was very sorry that he could not get 400 million won in such a short period of time. He desperately promised that if he was given time, then he would definitely pay for saving his worthless life. When Wu Jin heard the amount that idiot was talking about, he was completely at a loss. It was clear that he was in despair, but he was ready to do anything to save his life. Wu Jin finally realized that he had completely misunderstood his speech. On the other hand, he couldn't help but admit that modern children seem quite generous. Choosing a more comfortable position for himself, he decided that if Song-gu was wrong, then he really deserved to be taken advantage of. With his hands folded in front of him, the newly minted businessman, with a sly expression on his face, asked how long he would have to wait for his money. The next day, Wu Jin set out again to seek profit. A walk in the fresh air in a fairly nice area was how he started his morning. A little later, a car with a personal driver, Song-gu, arrived for him. Seeing him in a good mood on the way to the dungeon, Wu Jin asked him why he was so happy on his first day of work. In response, he said in a cheerful tone that even servants can be happy. Sun-gu actually amused Wu Jin, even though Wu Jin had no intention of considering him as that servant. As it turns out, last night, this ridiculous guy announced that since he can't return the 400 million won anytime soon, he's willing to become a member of his savior's group in order to give him a portion of his profits. After thinking for a moment, Wu Jin pointed out the flaw in this plan, saying that he was just going to stick to him, which seemed like an obvious and safe idea. Sun-gu didn't even think about personal gain, so he began to excitedly justify himself by saying that he just wanted to earn that money by being a truly useful person. Fearing rejection, he even declared his willingness to become his personal manager. With some admiration, he promised that in that case he would take full responsibility for choosing dungeons, booking, selling bloodstones, and other concerns, including even the possibility of being his personal driver. In response, Wu Jin said that if he was going to work like that, then that made him a personal servant. Song-gu felt a little offended. He was really hurt by these words, even though he knew that his savior was completely right. He smiled from ear to ear and awkwardly praised his boss for his very accurate observation. The conditions were really favorable. Wu Jin didn't mind the company of a guy he could trust. Pleased with this unexpected opportunity, he began to dictate terms that, surprisingly, turned out to be mutually beneficial. He said that in this case, their cooperation would last for a year, and since it would be too difficult to do it for free, his servants would even have their share of the total profit. His offer seemed like a real gift from fate. Sun Gu grabbed his boss's hand and sincerely thanked him for it. In response, Wu Jin said with a kind smile that he was also grateful to him for it. As a result, another good friend appeared in his circle. Looking at Song Gu, who was driving him to the pre-booked dungeon, the carefree awakened one thought that it was quite funny, because by pure chance, he got himself a servant due to a misunderstanding in which he actually wanted to return the excess. In fact, he understood that he was doing a great service for him, no less than he was receiving himself. Looking at this young man, he pleased him with the sudden words that if he would just do his job well, then 10% of the profits would be at his disposal. Hearing this, Song Gu turned away from the road and, with tears in his eyes, thanked his boss for what he was doing for him. When Wu Jin interrupted his snotty speech by asking if he had found the dungeon he had been told about, he immediately replied that at the boss's request, she had reserved a 3-star dungeon with the most monsters. They soon arrived at the third exit of Maebong Station, where a swarm of Reikis was located. Monsters like cockroaches weren't much of a problem in terms of battle difficulty, but their numbers were definitely very impressive. Sun Gu was at a loss, doubting whether they could handle such a task. He had 2 backpacks on his shoulders, and his only task was to collect trophies, but Wu Jin still asked him to keep an eye out, so as not to be accidentally hit by a surprise attack. The numerical superiority of the Rakia swarm was a serious problem, but not for a necromancer with a lot of experience behind him. Wu Jin got his bearings from the start. He had to spend all his points on control in order to increase the maximum number of his army. The number of skeletons he could control had grown to a massive 19, which was even more than the maximum number of participants in a single raid. Taking quantity with quantity and superior quality was a wise decision, but even so, they were in for a pretty hardcore playthrough. In just a moment, this floor turned into a bloody battlefield. It didn't take long before the swarm of Reikis thinned out to the point that the skeletons began to break through with increasing speed. Although the Raki did not have impressive intelligence, their instincts were enough to make them tremble with fear when the mage's familiars approached. The ruthless skeletons completed their task with ease. Although there were relatively few of them, in the end they greedily divided the remains of these monsters. Song Gu tried his best to keep up. Even during the battle on the first floor, he had started his work of collecting bloodstones, so it was a little delay before he caught up with his boss. As soon as he went down to the floor below, he didn't even pay attention to his boss's praise, because he was in an indescribable shock that the skeletons had managed to deal with the next batch of monsters. Watching with his mouth open, as the summoned fighters dealt with the monsters, he couldn't believe that they were advancing so quickly, because usually a raid on a Reiki dungeon takes at least 2 hours, while Wu Jin managed to do it on his own in just 15 minutes. The main fighter of their modest squad was already very tired of fighting at such a pace, so he sat down on a bench to finally rest. Opening the status window, he saw that he had already reached level 7 and had accumulated some achievement points that he could use to strengthen some of his stats. The skills he could learn at level 7 seemed boring and not particularly useful. The fire hand covered in flames required too many points, but did not provide any noticeable advantages, as did the water ball, which is a common mage spell. However, among these he found a really interesting option, which was the summoning of a skeleton mage. He could learn this skill already at level 10, so Wu Jin thought it would be a good idea to open it soon. Meanwhile, Sun Gu finished collecting trophies and even managed to find a return stone on his own. While in this dungeon, they were able to completely clear it in just 27 minutes, but Wu Jin was wondering what to do next. In fact, he hadn't thought about having much free time before, since they had booked the dungeon for 4 hours. As he climbed up, he informed his already tired servant that they would be able to go through this dungeon 7 more times during this time. As soon as they finished their first expedition, they immediately went to the Bloodstone Reception Center and received a whopping 53 million won for their trophies. Hearing the mention of such an incredible amount, Song-gu was at a loss, not understanding what the representative of this change point was talking about. A moment later, he felt an incredible shock from the realization that this was indeed the amount they had received. Their check was in his hands. They had earned more than 50 million. Realizing that at this rate the amount would soon be over 400 million, he began to tremble at the realization that his share would be a whopping 40 million won. Previously, he had been going to peer-to-peer dungeons for 2 months and had earned around 30 million, but here it was a whopping 40 million in one day. The amazing result was mind-blowing, and Sung-gu said he couldn't believe what was happening. With an incredibly happy expression on his face, he thanked his boss for what he was doing for him, calling him a truly great man. With a kind smile, Wu Jin asked him not to fuss, because it was still too early to rejoice. It was not the time to relax, knowing that they still had 7 more trips to the dungeon left. Following his boss, his subordinate called it an opportunity given by the gods, because as it turned out, becoming Wu Jin's manager was truly a great decision. The events surrounding the new awakened, who began to show incredible success, began to gradually spread. In the Hammer Guild, one of the 3 most powerful hunter organizations in Seoul, everything was as usual. The leader of one of the teams was enjoying his free time in the office. He was humming a song and making coffee when he was suddenly interrupted by a message. Without being distracted from his work, Captain Gay-min took the call and asked what had happened and why he was being disturbed. In response, he was told that 2 guys had bought a ticket for 4 o'clock in the morning and entered the dungeon. The interlocutor paid special attention to the fact that those guys were a little strange. People die in dungeons all the time, so Gay-ming didn't think there was anything strange about it. However, he was told in return that the strange thing was that those 2 were still alive. But what was equally strange was how long it took them to clear the 3-star dungeon. He reported that their first raid took 30 minutes, and on the second, they only spent 11 minutes. A moment later, he saw Wu Jin and Sung-gu exit the dungeon again, and on the 3rd raid they spent only 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The shocking result stunned the guys from the Hammer Guild. They couldn't believe how this was possible, because even professional teams of 8 people spend 2 hours on such raids. Having won a bet that the mysterious guys would do it in less than 10 minutes, the captain's subordinate who was watching them asked his boss if he could find information about those guys using their data from open sources. Gay-ming had never heard of A-rank guys clearing dungeons in a duo. However, he was wrong, and his shock increased to an unprecedented level when he learned that the 2 subjects being monitored were only F-rank. Hanging up, the captain replied that they should stay in touch for the time being while he could find out at least some information regarding those guys. When checking the data, he immediately found out that one of them, namely Wu Jin, had only registered in the hunter database 1 day ago, while the other member of the squad had only registered 2 months ago. This result indicated that such measurements were wrong. An excited smile appeared on the captain's face, realizing that this was too big of a measurement error, and those 2 should be assigned at least a C rank. Awakened ones with such serious abilities are likely to become high-ranking. He knew this for a long time, and had been waiting for guys with such potential for a long time, so he could not miss the opportunity to get them at his disposal. As expected, the Hwarang Guild was also watching the events. One of the managers of this organization noticed their strange activity and reported to Yun-hee that the guy who recently appeared in their sight was able to do something incredible. They had dealt with him before due to a report from a bureau employee that he had trespassed on their property. They already knew that Hong Sung-gu was an unremarkable fire mage, while the main power was possessed by Kang Woo-jin, an F-rank necromancer. The leader of their organization, turning to Captain Lee Yoon-hee, asked what she thought of his abilities. Recalling their meeting, she replied that she actually thought he was unusual, but not that unusual. Like Captain Jae-min of the Hammer Guild, she also came to the conclusion that Wu Jin must be at least a C-rank fighter. The leader agreed with her words and concluded that there were 2 options, the first being that he was hiding his abilities during the test, and the second option was that Wu Jin was growing at a crazy pace. It was the first time Lee Yun-hee had seen something like this, so she asked the more experienced leader if there had ever been an awakened who had such a speed of development that they could rise 2 or 3 ranks of power in one night. In response, the red-haired man said that there was a similar case in history where an awakened person rose from F to A rank in an insanely short time. His potential was a secret until he reached the #1 spot in South Korea. Naturally, they were talking about Kim Kang-chal, and understanding this, Yun-hee objected, saying that such a great hunter cannot be compared to some punks. Despite her opinion, the leader suggested not to be too sure of his guesses. He thought it would be a good idea to confirm who Wu Jin really was. Lee Sang-ho, the brother of Captain Ha-yun, who is the master of the Hwarang Guild, gave his sister the order to bring this guy to his office so that they could find out what kind of person he is. Meanwhile, the boys continued their non-stop raids in which Wu Jin became increasingly faster. On the other hand, Sun-gu, who had a completely different role, was barely able to stay conscious. While collecting bloodstones from defeated monsters, he thought that if such loads continued, he would be the first to die in the dungeon while extracting precious trophies. Turning to his boss, he asked in a tired voice if they could take a little rest. Seeing his condition, Wu Jin replied that he had done a good job. Even though Sun-gu was his servant by verbal contract, he respected his work and fatigue, so he took a short break. Song-gu sat down on the floor, immediately drank half a bottle of water, and said with a more cheerful expression that he felt much better now. When the boss asked how much time they had left, he replied that it was a little over an hour. They were doing much faster than expected, so after 3 hours of continuous dungeon raiding, they had already managed to earn around 400 million won. Wu Jin knew that this was enough to buy a house for Mom and Su-ah, and also for Sun-gu to have everything he needed. Based on this, he made a very unexpected decision. Rising to his feet, he gave his friend an incredible motivation by saying that all the remaining bloodstones would be completely under his control, and during this time he would be under his protection. Taking a deep breath, the boss suggested that his subordinate get everything he could, after which he suggested that they speed up. In just a moment, he rushed forward with great speed to attack the remaining monsters that were on the lower floors. Sun-gu was taken aback by Wu Jin's enthusiasm. The progression of strength gradually increased, and the fighter, using the crowbar and his familiars, turned into an increasingly powerful hunter. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he not only improved the skills of his skeletons, but also fought on the battlefield himself, improving his own characteristics. The rush sometimes made him need to act according to the situation. Previously, he was just a general who wisely led his army, but now, finding himself at the forefront of the battle, he himself often found himself in dangerous situations. However, in such a weak dungeon, he didn't really feel the pressure from the monsters, because their numbers weren't a problem thanks to his 19 skeletons, and he himself could easily deal with surprise attacks. After 3 hours of constant raiding, he finally reached the long-awaited 10th level. Having cleared another floor and received a message about his level increasing, he decided that this should be enough to strengthen his army. When he opened the system window, a new notification suddenly appeared in front of him, saying that he had fulfilled the level requirements for class assignment. Wu Jin was surprised because when he was in Alphen, this did not happen. With a thoughtful look, he said that in Alphen, classes were also determined by reaching level 10, but he was already a necromancer, so he did not understand what was happening with the system. A moment later, the system began to work with special persistence, analyzing the player's development in order to assign him one of the possible classes. As it turned out, he actually became a dual class, gaining a second class that was a warrior. Wu Jin felt a little uneasy thinking that this might be a problem, but he couldn't refuse such an offer. In addition, he was given a bonus in the form of a warrior weapon. Based on his experience, Wu Jin believed that being a mage was definitely more advantageous, as the characteristics overlapped with necromancy. Unfortunately, he did not receive the mage class, but became a warrior. If he had known that this would happen, he would have used magic instead of waving a crowbar. He had no other option but to accept such a decision of fate. Ignoring the details, he looked with particular interest at the bonus in the form of a warrior's weapon, which became his reward for acquiring new abilities. The mysterious gift item appeared in front of him, but in reality, it looked more like an ordinary steel pipe. As soon as he touched the warrior's weapon, he received a notification about its properties. As it turned out, it was a steel staff that grows with the user and will come to him at the first call. After looking at this item, Wu Jin still smiled, realizing that a weapon with increasing characteristics was not so bad. He thought with anticipation about what it would become in the future. After finishing receiving the unexpected rewards, he returned to his original plan, obtaining the Necromancer bonus in the form of the Demon Seal Catalyst. The item known as the Demon Seal Crystal is a magical crystal that is obtained by necromancers upon reaching certain levels. The 7 crystals inside are great familiars, incomparable to the skeletal soldiers. With their help, on Alphen, he destroyed all the enemies who dared to come to Alendal, the land that belonged to him. With a smile of anticipation, he wondered who he would get this time. As he opened the seal, the crystal began to shatter with a blinding purple light. Wu Jin folded his hands in front of him, waiting to see the familiar he would receive from this crystal. A moment later, a succubus with black wings appeared in front of him, a short blonde with large eyes and bright red lips. It seems the necromancer had already seen her before and was stunned that it was she who appeared in front of him. It was Bibi, and when she saw her master, she asked with tears in her eyes where he had disappeared to. While Wu Jin was trying to figure out why she was the one who appeared from the crystal, Bibi rushed at him with hugs and screamed that she really missed her master. There were a lot of questions, the first of which were why she didn't stay on Alphen and what was going on in general, since she somehow miraculously ended up on Earth. With tears in her eyes, Bibi explained that after their master disappeared, all the familiars were placed in the seal space. After these words, Wu Jin realized that they had all moved along with him, but were now sealed until their master gained enough power to return them to his control. Bibi continued tearfully talking about how much she missed her master, but after a moment she remembered something important and stopped. As it turned out, it was because she smelled a strange smell. Looking around, she asked why she could smell that in such a place. Wu Jin couldn't even guess that all this time he had been smelling Tranit's subjects from them. Hearing this, he was shocked, because he himself could not even imagine who was behind such an expansion of monsters on Earth. The one he feared to see on his home planet was a demon that invaded Alphen from a mysterious dimension and destroyed 90% of the local population. Wu Jin had never fought him, but his subjects invaded his domain, Alendal, so often that the sight of them made him sick. It has now become clear that the fact that Tranet is gradually invading Earth is the reason for the sudden appearance of the dungeons. Finding himself on his home planet, Wu Jin thought that he had escaped from Hell, but as it turned out, Hell was following him. Meanwhile, near the station where they were fighting, some representatives of large hunter organizations had already appeared. There were enough guys interested in Wu Jin, among whom were leaders of large teams. Looking at his watch, Ha Min replied to the representative of the large organization that the recruits they were interested in entered the dungeon 8 minutes ago, so they should be coming out soon. According to him, those who interested their leader so much were not simpletons, because they earned more than 400 million won, working only 2 people, and only in 1 dungeon in less than 4 hours. This guy, observing the situation, believed that with such strength, he too would be able to clear dungeons at such a speed. Meanwhile, all attention turned to the guys because they finally came out of the dungeon. Sungu could barely move his legs, while Wu Jin was fine, but still thought about the disturbing news he had learned after his first familiar had appeared. Jin Min Chang broke the silence by complimenting them on their good work in the dungeon. With a smile on his face, he asked if they would mind giving him a few minutes of their time to listen to one of the most fateful proposals of their lives. In response, Wu Jin coldly walked past and replied without much interest that he refused their offer. Hearing such an unexpected answer, Jin felt despair and threw aside his pride and ran after them, begging them to stop. With a sullen look, Wu Jin asked why he was asking if they were willing to listen, if he was going to waste their valuable time anyway. Mr. Min Chang was very worried about the situation. His face was covered in cold sweat due to the difficult dialogue. He couldn't understand what was wrong with the guy who, by recruiting him, his career would skyrocket. In response, he apologized for wasting their time all this time with his beating around the bush. Having regained his former respectable appearance, he handed over his business card and said that they should get down to business because the Hammer Guild wanted to recruit them. But even after the direct text, Wu Jin turned around and started walking away, shocking even his protege with the answer that he was not interested. Jun, having lost his pride again, started running after them, assuming that they simply did not know who they were. Wu Jin knew that this wasn't going to stop just like that, so he turned back to the pushy leader of the hunting team and said that he heard that they were one of the top 3 guilds in Korea. Jin Min Chang felt a little relieved after hearing that he was being treated properly. After that, he extended his business card towards the promising hunter and said that their guild had the strongest of the awakened within its ranks. He promised that if they joined them, then they would receive the best support without delay. Skipping formalities, Wu Jin, calling the representative of one of the strongest organizations simply a man, asked him to stop this meaningless dialogue. With an angry look, he said that he was in a noticeably bad mood, so it was worth stopping to irritate him, so as not to run into rudeness. His behavior seemed unusual to other people, because no one even guessed what was threatening their planet. Having earned a large sum, Wu Jin stopped at an interesting place, after which, together with his mother and sister, he went to one of the most prosperous areas of the city. His mother was shocked to learn that her son, a few days after his return, led them to a huge house that the realtor said now belonged to their family. She was excited about what was happening, realizing that such a home would cost an unimaginable amount of money. Looking at her son, who had a calm smile on his face, she still wondered how he was going to buy such a house. Looking at his phone, he replied that he had recently replenished his account and could now afford it. His mother was shocked to hear such words, and the son was forced to explain that he was actually a wanderer who made money in the dungeons. As expected, his mother was very worried. She couldn't allow her son to take such a risk after losing a family member once. However, Wu Jin insisted that she had nothing to worry about after all. He wasn't weak at all, and hunting in the dungeon was like fighting cockroaches for him. Even after all his arguments, his mother could not accept his words, but her daughter joined the conversation, asking if she could have a dog. She reminded her that they could have one if they had a house with at least some lawn, and here it was just huge. With a devil in her eyes, she tugged at her clothes again, and in response, the worried mother asked her to wait while she sorted out what was happening. Seeing her worry, Wu Jin asked her not to worry. Placing his hand on his little sister's head, he said that they should consider this as compensation for the hard times they had to endure due to the fact that there had been no male in their family for 5 years. With a kind smile, he asked them to just believe in his strength. In fact, this is how he was able to calm their worries, and soon the family moved into a new, spacious house. That same evening, Wu Jin went for a walk. Having gone around the corner of one of the houses, he turned to Bibi and asked her to come out of hiding. His summoning began to work, but she never appeared before him. As he repeated his words, he saw that the trail of summoning magic began to lead him around the corner of the building. He was surprised, because when he looked around, Bibi was still not there. A moment later, he saw a cat with strange energy passing by, so he assumed that she was his familiar in a very unusual form for her. As it turned out, it really was her. Wu Jin couldn't understand why she had turned into a cat, but he couldn't mistake those eyes for anything else. When he picked her up, he heard that she couldn't take her true form outside the dungeon. As it turned out, because of this, she had to find a small organism that could become a vessel for her. This turned out to be a street black cat that was nearby. Hearing this, Wu Jin was surprised, because he did not understand why it did not work as before. After that, he asked if Bibi sensed any other energy sources of Tranit that was trying to invade Earth. In response, he heard that everything was clean, and there was a pleasant smell of peace all around. Her words surprised Wu Jin even more, because it was the first time he saw a demon enjoying the smell of peace. Still, he came to the very pleasant conclusion that Tranet's energy had not yet affected this world. He was suddenly distracted by the voice of a stranger who called him full of surprises, relying on the assumption that Wu Jin even took care of stray cats. Looking around, the necromancer saw another mysterious man who was very interested in his strength and personality. With a pleasant smile, the red-haired man who introduced himself as the Eyes of the Hwarang Guild asked if it would be difficult for him to spare a little time for a conversation. While Wu Jin was with Li Sang-ho, his subordinate Sungu visited a place he had only dreamed of visiting before. While in a luxury car showroom, he waited to meet the dealer, still wondering what could explain his boss's strange behavior. When they were returning from work to the dungeon, he asked the question that was troubling him directly. He wondered why he had turned down the offer from the Hammer Guild, which other hunters could only dream of. With a heavy sigh, Wu Jin replied that he just wanted to. Sun Gu was surprised by this answer, as it sounded as if his boss was some kind of cheeky schoolboy. Wu Jin explained that he simply hated following anyone's orders. Alarmed by this answer, Song Gu, with cold sweat on his face, replied that even the almighty Hammer Guild could not compare to the strength of his boss. Still, he wasn't sure if Wu Jin's arrogance and pride were the only reason he turned down a lucrative partnership with the guild that could have opened the door for them to earn more and grow. While inside the incredible car showroom, he answered with a sly laugh that the reason was no longer so important, because soon he would have the opportunity to drive the car he had dreamed of for so long. With his hands folded in front of him and his eyes looking up, he made the decision that all he would do from now on was trust and follow his boss. A moment later, his thoughts were interrupted by the dealer, who came out to meet him, apologizing for keeping him waiting. They immediately brought him a contract and asked if he wanted to sign it right away. Being so close to his dream, Song Gu agreed to the proposal without hesitation. Meanwhile, his boss was in one of the cafes, where he was already being apologized to for how his first meeting with the Hwarang Guild had been. What Li Sang meant was that he had a run-in with Yun He over a misunderstanding about visiting their dungeon without permission. Hearing this name, Wu Jin immediately knew that it was about that crazy woman with red hair. The guild leader explained that in fact, although she is his younger sister, she is very different from him due to her explosive nature. He folded his hands in front of him and said with a kind smile that Yun He was very valuable to the guild, so he was ready to compensate for any tricky situations involving her. Wu Jin shook his head and said there was no need for that, then suggested that they move on to the real reason for his visit. Continuing to smile, Sanho replied that he was quite smart in negotiations despite only having recently graduated from high school and not even having much experience in talking to hunters. He admitted that he had actually observed his progress, which he could confidently call a stunning progression, which was impossible for a rank F. He believed that Wu Jin belonged to a rank C at the very least, especially considering what had happened in the raid he had participated in today. With an anticipatory look, he said that he was confident that Wu Jin was one step away from the top ranks, and it was only a matter of time. After listening to his compliments, Wu Jin immediately realized that they were now also interested in having him at their disposal. Seeing his mood, Sanho confirmed his suspicions and asked him to join the Hwarang Guild, promising that they would be able to provide the best conditions for his development. Wu Jin wasn't interested in such proposals, so he decided to act quite unexpectedly and suggested that what they called the conditions for development was that the role of the leader would be transferred to him if he could defeat him in a duel. Considering it to be just a friendly joke, Mr. Li replied with a laugh that he expected nothing less from him, having heard about his self-confidence. In response, he said with a kind smile that he leads the Hwarang Guild not because of his awakened skills, because his B rank is worth nothing in comparison even to his sister's rank, which is A rank. Relying on these words, he gave a full answer that therefore he could not give him his place, even if he defeated him in battle. In response, Wu Jin stood up from the table and started walking towards the exit, disrespectfully replying that in that case he was not interested. He was suddenly stopped by a startling question from the Hwarang leader. Mr. Li coldly asked him if he knew why dungeons appeared on Earth. Seeing Wu Jin's interest, he said that it had been 5 years since the underground tremor, but they still hadn't found out anything about the dungeons. However, according to his observations, the dungeons were getting bigger, and the monsters inside them were much stronger than before. But humanity is not at all frightened by this, because people are completely immersed in earning money from bloodstones. Mr. Li Sang-ho is absolutely sure that the world will drown in chaos if everything continues like this. With a sincere look, he made the most advantageous proposal at the moment. He said that gathering the awakened to stop this was his true purpose. Looking towards the promising hunter, he expressed hope that he would entrust them with his strength. The next morning, the Hammer Guild was truly restless. The leader of the 4th team was in a truly terrible mood, which made his entire team worry. Suddenly, Assistant Leader Jin noticed something interesting. He immediately turned to his boss, saying that the guys they were interested in had already managed to book exit 6 of Guaishan Station. Hearing this, Mr. Jin became furious, saying that he shouldn't spoil the mood by talking about that impudent boy at such an early hour. Walking towards the window, Jun Min Chang began to rant about how good Wu Jin was, suggesting that he would be a C-rank hunter at best. However, his out-loud thoughts were interrupted by a message that the newbie they were interested in had booked a dungeon with a 4-star difficulty. Hearing this, Mr. Jun almost choked on his coffee, thinking that the madman had signed his own death warrant. He ran to the computer without delay and made sure that they had again reserved such a difficult area in order to clear it together. With a cold sweat on his face, he confirmed his suspicions that those guys had gone crazy. In fact, F rank can't enter dungeons higher than 4 stars, and in that case, they would only be able to go if they were part of a mining or support team. From the very beginning, Leader Jun saw that they were newbies who were booking dungeons without even basic knowledge, and yet he was still tormented by the question of what kind of abilities they possessed to be able to clear such a difficult dungeon. In response, Jun asked if there was a 4-star dungeon nearby. As it turned out, it was Cheongsa Station Exit. Hearing his guess confirmed, the leader thought that it was quite close to what the guys he was interested in had booked. He asked his subordinate to try to cancel the booking in order to interest Wu Jin. The subordinate thought that his boss had already given up, but he confidently replied that this time they would be able to sign a contract with those guys. He believed that if you want to catch fish, then you need to prepare the right bait, which was their dungeon. Meanwhile, Sungu and Wu Jin were racing towards the reserved dungeon in a new car. Sungu drove around in his dream car all night, saying he bought it because he didn't want to drive his boss around in an old sledgehammer. In response, Wu Jin, grateful for such attention, praised him for his efforts. Looking around, he nodded his head and concluded that this car was clearly on a completely different level, even considering that its interior was simply something. Despite all the questions raised by the fact that the boss didn't know much about cars, Sungu didn't show his resentment, and replied that he would do his best to make sure that his Hyungnim would travel between his stops with maximum comfort. They were expecting a big catch, but when they arrived at their destination, they heard the local inspector complaining. He said that he couldn't imagine 2 F-rank guys clearing a 4-star dungeon. Sungu assured them that everything was fine, and that they were confident in their abilities, but the representative of the Hunters Association still refused to let them in. He said that it was suicide, and it was not about him not wanting to take responsibility for such an act. It was clear that he was afraid of damaging the reputation of the Hunting Association, and besides, those were the rules. After listening to the inspector's dissatisfaction, Songgu returned with sad news to his boss, who was waiting for him nearby. With an uncertain look, he said that he could not convince the inspector because he said that they were not allowed to visit this dungeon. He apologized to the boss for not investigating the matter from the beginning. Wu Jin didn't blame him for the money he had paid. There was nothing he could do about it, so he said that they should spend the next day reassessing their abilities. In order not to waste time, he asked Ha Min to check if there were any 3-star dungeons nearby. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a man in formal clothes, who said that he could not believe that they had met again near the dungeon. As expected, it was Mr. Jun, who had planned to meet like this from the beginning. Calling this situation fate, he asked what had happened and if he could help them in any way. With a kind smile, he tried not to show that he had hoped from the very beginning that he would meet them in this way. Without hiding his obvious suspicions, Wu Jin mockingly repeated his words that this was indeed fate. With his hands on his hips, he asked the curious leader of the 4th team of the Hammer organization how exactly he was going to help them. Without further ado, they headed to the Guachin Government Complex Station, where they had prepared a dungeon for these guys in advance. Recalling their failure, Leader Jun guessed that they didn't know that only C rank and above were allowed into 4-star dungeons. Pointing his hand at this station, he said that this 4-star dungeon was at their guild's disposal, and all reservations had been cancelled, making them free to enter. Wu Jin had this place at his disposal thanks to the help of the Hammer Guild, and he expressed suspicion that it was too good to be true. He said that all such concessions had to be paid for, so he asked what they wanted from him in return. With a kind smile on his face, Leader Jun assured that this was just a gesture of goodwill, and they would resolve their friends' rank issues on their own, so they could clear this dungeon to their heart's content without worrying about the Hunter Association's reaction. Taking his words into consideration, Wu Jin replied that if that was really the case, then they would be most happy to agree to this proposal. After these words, the leader of the fourth team wished them good luck in passing, but asked them to stay for another minute to receive a gift from him. Waving his hand, he asked to walk with him a few meters. Next to them stood their work car, in which the gift in question had been previously located. Opening the trunk, Leader Jun said with a sly laugh that everything has to be paid for. Min Chang didn't ask for anything in return, but he was in anticipation, thinking that a favor is always repaid with a favor. It's no secret that there is an unspoken rule that if someone shares food with you, it's natural for a person to share in return. Although Wu Jin was obviously a strong awakened, Leader Jun didn't know him well enough, and thought that he was just a kid who was 24 years old. He was more than sure that he already had him on his hook. In turn, the subordinate of the leader of the fourth team thought exactly the same. It was not the first time he had carried out this scheme together with his boss, so he began to play his own game, making a compliment that the mood of their dear friend had changed for the better. When Wu Jin asked what he was talking about, he replied that yesterday he was in such a mood that it was scary to even talk to him. Remembering that day, the necromancer agreed, because he really was in a bad mood due to the fact that all his thoughts were occupied with Tranit's presence on his dear earth. Seeing how Wu Jin was gradually becoming more open to communication, the trickster from the Hammer Guild asked with a smile on his face if they would mind having a drink together after their raid was over. Wu Jin agreed without hesitation, and that impudent office plankton immediately came to the conclusion that the kid had fallen for his manipulations. Having been in the Hammer Guild for 2 years now, he was confident that their tactics were impeccable, and that their target would soon sign a contract with them, especially after they had a few shots of strong soju. He continued to talk about celebrating their success, mentioning that he knew of a nice place nearby. Watching this whole stupid performance, Sungu felt a little awkward, realizing that it was a waste of time, because no matter how much they sucked up, his Hyunim still wouldn't join their guild. When Jin Min Chang returned, he stopped for a moment, looking around the area for the guys he had brought to this place. When Ha Min asked where those guys had gone, he replied that they had already gone to the dungeon. Hearing this, Mr. Jin began to shake with anxiety, saying that he had asked them to wait so that he could give them a gift for the journey. He was furious, and his protege did not understand what his anger was about. He believed that he was going to wait for them to return anyway, so this gift could be given after their raid. As it turns out, this gift was a much-needed survival kit, without which you can't go on raids on 4-star dungeons. Throwing the 2 bags on the ground, the leader asked Ha Min how much the F-ranked guys who entered such dungeons knew, and whether they had heard about the dangers of such a raid. With a worried look, Mr. Jun thought about the fact that for such dungeons, a D-rank team with a C-rank leader was recommended. He knew that Kang Wu Jin was only an F-rank on paper, and with his speed at clearing 3-star dungeons, he should be able to defeat the monsters in this dungeon. But despite this, his success was in great question due to the fact that he did not take the necessary equipment, because from 4-star to 6-star dungeons are different from low-level ones. If you go there without information and a survival kit, even a high-ranking hunter will not return alive. With his hand to his face, Leader Jin said that this was the end, because with their actions they had not helped, but had literally sent those guys on a deadly raid. Meanwhile, the boys had already cleared a significant portion of the dungeon, clearing all the floors with ease. Looking around, Wu Jin wondered if this was really a 4-star dungeon, considering the monsters they encountered along the way were all too common. Songgu assumed that it was just an easy 4-star dungeon, and his boss decided to agree with it to avoid straining his brain. All the bloodstones had been collected, so Wu Jin activated the search for the return stone. Unexpectedly for him, there was no reaction to the use of his ability. Wu Jin thought that it couldn't be that there wasn't such an object near them. He couldn't even imagine that this wasn't the whole dungeon, and that they only saw the open part of it, so he chalked it up to his skill being too low. In order not to waste time, they decided to return to the place where they started, looking around. For the first time in all the raids, they encountered such an unusual problem. Walking through the same place once again, Songgu noticed that the place where the entrance had previously been had moved somewhere and no longer looked the same as before. Suddenly, he stopped and said in surprise that something was wrong here. A bright glow appeared before them, which provided answers to their troubling questions. Where they were looking for a way out of the dungeon, a portal suddenly appeared that led them deeper, to the hidden part of this place. It became obvious that the portal had not caused the return stone to appear. They had no other option but to enter and continue clearing the dungeon. With an anticipatory smile on his face, Woojin said that he now understood why this was a 4-star dungeon. They were near a portal, beyond which a real survival game awaited them. Still, the guys decided not to delay, because even though their trip was paid for by the Hammer Guild, they could not waste precious time thinking. Having passed through this portal, Woojin was surprised by what he saw in front of him. They found themselves in another change, and Songu began to behave strangely. For some unknown reason, he stripped naked, and Woojin couldn't understand what he was planning. He immediately looked away and asked with some awkwardness why he did it. In response, he heard a disgruntled cry about Hunim also standing naked in front of him. Looking around, Woojin realized that only their bodies could move through this portal, while their clothes remained in the place where they entered this teleport. The strange forest they found themselves in greeted them with some strange animal cry. Standing there without clothes was a pretty bad idea. While Songu was panicking, his boss was becoming increasingly surprised at what was happening, becoming increasingly convinced that this was indeed a dungeon of a completely different level from the ones they had been in before. Thanks to his skills, Woojin quickly obtained the necessary items to survive in this dimension without wasting any time, even covering basic needs such as clothing. Seeing how he could control space, Songu couldn't contain his delight. Woojin continued to amaze him with his skills and how he acted coolly in any situation. Even though they had been working together lately, he still seemed like a complete mystery. While Songu was trying to guess what his boss was doing, he was distributing his experience points. At that moment he was at level 10, and thanks to the bonuses transferred from Alphen, his stats were much higher than those of guys with the same level. Even so, he knew that a 4-star dungeon was still dangerous. For example, in the Rocky dungeon, the necromancer's skills were enough. But here everything was different, because he could meet strong enemies with whom he would have to fight face to face. Considering all the risks, he decided to use the rest of his experience points to learn warrior skills. Now he had several movement abilities, a strong blow, anger, and warrior intuition in his arsenal. Having prepared everything necessary, the guys rushed into battle in order to direct time in the right direction without delay. The first monsters were already close, and Songu, who was still panicking at being in such a place, asked his boss to be on guard. The huge lizard rushed through the dense forest towards the unexpected guests at high speed, while Woojin appeared right in front of it in an instant. Before the monster could even comprehend it, the dual-class fighter suddenly appeared above his head. Thanks to the warrior's intuition, Woojin was able to assess the enemy's strength in a split second. As it turned out, it was a crocodile with a strength level of... This was his first opportunity to experience firsthand what monsters of such a high level were like. While the level 10 fighter was fighting a level 31 monster and waiting for even worse monsters to come, the outside of the station was still restless. The guys from the Hammer Guild hoped for their quick return, but the barrier never disappeared. Based on this, it was logical to assume that the guys were still alive, but they had no way to know what was happening inside. Time in such dungeons was 4 times faster than on Earth, so Leader June assumed that about 2 hours had already passed there. His protege continued to wonder how long they could hold out, and whether they could, with their combined efforts, resist even a crocodile. In fact, although the guys knew how incredible the newcomer they were interested in was, even the leader of the 4th team doubted that fighting bare-handed against monsters above level 30 was something possible. Of course, he was most worried about the guys going inside without a survival kit. He didn't know what Woojin's abilities were, so he was worried about them not having any equipment. The portals in high-level dungeons don't allow materials from Earth to pass through, and it's dangerous. The only things that could be brought were things from other dimensions or made from materials using blood crystals. Clutching his head, Jinmin Chang, who thought this was the end of his whole plan, said that even if their guys could deal with the monster, the main problem would be the lack of water and food. One problem was replaced by another, because they understood that even if it was difficult to survive empty-handed in the Amazon jungle, then there was no talk of such survival in the portal of a high-level dungeon. While the guys from the Hammer Guild were tormented by their sad assumptions, there was a feast in the dungeon portal that could be envied. The previously excited Songu enjoyed the incredible crocodile meat with a smile on his face, to which his boss was even able to get the spices he used on Alphen. Their time together seemed like some kind of vacation. Wu Jin was quite knowledgeable about such things, and in addition to cooking gourmet meat, he also knew how to choose a decent beer, which goes well with such a kebab. After taking a few sips of the low-alcohol drink, Songu completely forgot about all his worries, saying that he would never forget this trip to the dungeon. Wu Jin was glad that he was able to please this friend, because earlier, in Alphen, he had no one to share such joys of life with except the demons that were his familiars. While the guys were resting inside the portal, having perfect conditions for this business, the captain of the hammer team and his protege continued to worry about the fact that a lot of time had passed. On the one hand, they already believed that the newcomers to the hunter business could survive, but there were still doubts. As an experienced leader of a hunting team, Jun Min Chang assumed that they could somehow defeat the crocodile by distracting it with the necromancer's calls. However, he was more than sure that such a difficult fight would not give any advantages in the future, especially in the swamps. For those who have at least some understanding of such dungeons, it is no secret that the swamps that appear from time to time in the jungles of such portals are simply a death sentence for melee fighters. Even for our guys, it was quite difficult to move. Their legs got stuck, and danger was on all sides. At this point, they had to be on guard, because you could never be sure that in a moment the Hokos and swamp anacondas would not pounce at the same time. Only Hong Sung-gu had long-range combat, but his fireballs weren't enough to stop Hoko's crazy monkeys. The guys from the Hammer Guild team knew about this too, so their worries continued to grow, not taking them away from the thought that their brilliant idea had come to an end because of one missed detail. As it turned out, they were wrong once again. While Sung-gu watched motionlessly as everything happened, Wu Jin continued to incinerate the monsters, despite being a primarily close-range fighter. Watching this, Sung-gu was once again shocked to realize how limitless his Hyungnim's skills were. This time, Wu Jin demonstrated the summoning of skeletons with magic. Using fire, they instantly incinerated all the monkeys, because each of them had a power that exceeded Song-gu's. While the boys overcame one obstacle after another, using the skills and experience of the leader of their small squad, the representatives of the Hammer Guild waiting for them had a small snack with instant noodles. 4 whole hours had already passed, and the ward continued to ask his leader whether they would be able to clear the dungeon. Jun Min Chang was still tense. He still didn't know the exact answer, and this time he added an important detail that it wasn't only the monsters that were dangerous in high-level dungeons, because there were plenty of unfamiliar plants, animals, and insects there. They didn't even doubt that the newcomers who entered a high-level dungeon for the first time knew nothing about such ecosystems. This meant that there was a high chance that they would eat something poisonous due to hunger. Meanwhile, Sun-gu, who was under the care of the all-knowing Hyungnim, was enjoying tropical fruits. He liked them very much, because they were sweet and very tasty. Wu Jin explained to him that they were mortally dangerous when raw, but after cooking on fire, they became edible. Hearing this, the ward became frightened and immediately spat out everything he had managed to chew. He even started to resent his Hyungnim for not warning him in advance. Wu Jin laughed good-naturedly at his protege's clumsiness, because he couldn't explain to him how he knew about everything inside such places. It was not yet time to reveal the secret that his life in Alphen had lasted for 20 years. While inside the dungeon, Wu Jin and Sun-gu took their time to avoid making a mistake. It was already dark outside, but the guys from the Hammer Guild were still waiting for them to return. Their conversations became more frank, and now the ward wanted to know if his leader had a reason why he wanted Kang Wu Jin so much. Their guild wasn't particularly interested in this deal, but over the past 5 years, it was Jun Min Chang who had been able to find a huge number of talents and believed that his eyes had never deceived him in this matter. Hamin was delighted to recall the stories of his leader recruiting rising stars that had become very famous. He assumed that he was the one who first learned about their A-rank fighter, known as Park Jin-woo. As it turned out, it was indeed Jun Min Chan, but he surprised his protege even more when he said that he was now more than sure that Kang Wu Jin would become much cooler than the one in question. He had put so much effort into recruiting Wu Jin, so now he hoped that his efforts would pay off, and that crazy guy would return alive. Otherwise, his death would be a huge loss for all of humanity. Ha-min couldn't even imagine that his captain had such thoughts in his head. He cheerfully suggested to his boss to pray for those guys to get out of the dungeon alive. In response, Mr. Jun once again said tensely that it would not be as easy as one might think. Even though he voiced his thoughts about Wu Jin's prospects, he was not confident that he could handle the guardian of the returning stone, which was a truly strong opponent. In fact, everyone knows how difficult it is to fight the guard, so Ha-min thought that praying for their return wouldn't be a bad idea. However, the leader continued to act extremely pessimistic, saying that Wu Jin would definitely meet his death in this fierce battle. Meanwhile, the boys continued to move forward. Now, they were in the middle of some wasteland, which led them to the place that was so necessary for their return. Song-gu stopped the moment he saw the stone of return in the distance. He began to hurry forward, joyfully saying that they would finally be able to get out of this terrible place. Seeing his ward rushing to die, Wu Jin stopped him by pulling his hood. A moment later, a trap appeared in front of them, the surface suddenly crumbling, revealing sharp bamboo sticks below. Song-gu almost lost his life in his haste, so he thanked his Hyung-nim with great gratitude for watching over him. Wu Jin didn't react in any way, but only continued to look into the distance with particular interest. His friend didn't understand what had caught his savior's attention, so he looked around. It only took him a moment to realize that the trap wasn't the only thing that could stop them from getting the Hearthstone. A moment after the trap was activated, they saw a large number of high-level monsters appear. It seemed like a real problem, but Wu Jin had expected something like this. In front of them appeared quite serious enemies, which were much stronger than the crocodile they encountered as soon as they passed through the portal. It was a small detachment of Alphen orcs, consisting of warriors and mages of level. The population of Alphen consists of a huge number of races, among which are humans, elves, dwarves, beastmen, and even orcs. Another question was what they were doing in the dungeon on Earth. They had no other option but to find out personally. Not much time had passed since Wu Jin's return to Earth, so he still had a good command of the Alphen language, with which he inquired why the orcs were on his planet. Seeing how the enemies reacted to the boss's mysterious speech, Song-gu was once again at a loss, realizing that he still didn't know much about his new friend. The orcs began to look around, not understanding how this man from a planet not native to them knew their language. In response, one of them asked who he was and how he knew the language of Alphen. Wu Jin didn't intend to answer this question, so he asked them to ignore it and asked again what they were doing in such a place. One of the orcs paused for a moment before answering. It seemed to him that it was unpleasant and difficult to talk about how they had all lost their home. Jin was shocked because his guess was correct. Tranet defeated them all. According to the orc, when the balance was broken, Tranet became the master of everything that was on Alphen. They are here precisely because of the contract with the new master of their planet. It was strange to hear about some kind of contract from the lips of the orcs who had lost everything because of the new master of Alphen. As it turned out, this contract was incredibly tricky. Following it, the orcs would receive Earth under their control and it would become their new home. Hearing this, Wu Jin wondered how they could fall for such a stupid trick, since Tranet doesn't even own Earth, making this contract even more pointless than serving such a scumbag. Taking out his weapon, Wu Jin showed that he had no intention of playing around with those who were intruders into his home. In response to his determination, the orc leader shouted to his squad to immediately rush into the attack. This battle was a real challenge because never before had the guys faced so many opponents with such a huge level of strength. Wu Jin was extremely calm, knowing that he had to keep a cool head in order to deal with such a problem. This battle decided his fate as well as the fate of his ward because, without passing these guys, they would not be able to get to the Stone of Return. A little more time passed, and the guys from the Hammer Guild were still waiting for their return near the barrier. Outside, 6 hours and 20 minutes passed, but Ha-min was still encouraging his leader and said with a joyful tone once again that he had a good feeling. At this moment, Junmin Chang, who had been pondering the situation all this time, began to realize that they were probably crossing the swamp, or, which was unlikely, were already near the orc squad that guarded the return stone, since more than 1 day had passed. He was amazed at the thought that those two actually had a chance to clear this dungeon that belonged to a high-ranking dimension. Suddenly, the barrier began to disappear before their eyes, which shocked them even more in their moment of deep thought. Min Chang literally felt a lump in his throat, realizing that this was a fateful moment, because there were two options. Looking down, he froze, hoping that the boys would return. However, the hope that they would return alive began to fade gradually. The barrier disappeared, but they still didn't come out. Ha-min understood his boss's feelings, because this meant only one thing, that the worst-case scenario had become reality, and they were finished. Disappointed with what happened, Jun Min-chang was devastated and was about to fill his emptiness with alcohol, so he suggested to Ha-min that they go back. However, a moment later, he heard footsteps and tired, dissatisfied words about taking a cart with him on the next raid. Looking down, he saw the guys dragging a huge number of artifacts obtained from inside the dungeon. The sadness of loss suddenly changed to sincere joy and gratitude to fate, and Leader Jun congratulated Wu Jin with great delight on his return to the surface. With the same calm smile, Wu Jin, who didn't even look tired, asked why the guys from the Hammer Guild were so happy to see him. Returning back after a long raid, the guys got acquainted with the details that they missed before entering the dungeon. Wu Jin came to the conclusion that the survival kit was not very necessary, but the information was very much so.